Hey guys, tonight we begin our gentle descent into boring history for sleep, the soothing dawn churns of Tudor milkmaids. Picture sleepy village lanes at first light, dew-kissed pails of frothy milk, and the soft, rhythmic click of wooden churns as dawn tiptoes across the fields. If you truly enjoy these hushed excursions through time, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it soothes your spirit. And while you settle in, share your location and local time in the comments below. Let's remind ourselves just how beautifully vast our nighttime community can be. Now dim the lights, switch on a soft fan breeze and find your coziest spot. Let your shoulders drop, your thoughts drift, and your eyelids grow heavy. Soon we'll tiptoe alongside those Tudor milkmaids, guided by the whisper of early morning chores. Now the story begins. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and focus on the tale. Soon you will drift into restful slumber. The screen now fades to darkness. The world before dawn is hushed in a cloak of mist and dew. In the silent stretch of fields that border our small village, each blade of grass holds a bead of moisture that trembles with the weight of night's borrowed breath. A distant rooster, perched somewhere among the thatched rooftops and hedgerows, summons the coming day with a single sonorous call, an echo that drifts along the empty lanes and stirs the stirrings of cottage life. Here, at the furthest corner of the common, the milkmaids, Mary, Edith, Alice, and young Joan, are already stirring from their pallets, drawn awake by that solemn herald and by the soft rumble of their own task-laden hearts. In Mary's cottage, a faint glow of embers clings to the hearth's recess. The fire, banked with ash from the night's last cooking, still offers a pale warmth, reminding the milkmaids that they are fortunate to labor under its flicker rather than beneath a truly freezing sky. Their wooden floorboards, bare and worn smooth by many such pre-dawn rites, give a gentle creak as each girl's foot slides free of the straw bedding. The scent of damp linen and hearth smoke blends with the faint perfume of honeysuckle that drapes the window frame outside, swallowed now by dark. A second crow from the rooster seems to speak of further insistence, and so Mary slides from her pallet, her bare feet pressing into the chill of the floor. She lifts the woolen blanket that has kept her shoulders from the draft and smooths down her linen shifts. The pale garment feels cool and crisp, each thread a reminder that simple cloth can still be a comfort against night's lingering breath. Across the room, Edith stirs on her own pallet. Her breath, visible in the cold air, puffs and glides toward the low ceiling beams before fading away. Mary's hand reaches for a wooden bucket nestled beside the hearthstone. She hefts it easily, finding reassurance in its familiar weight. The bucket's iron bands, darkened by age, have little nicks and dings that tell the tale of seasons upon seasons of early morning errands. Slipping on her leather shoes, she ties the worn laces carefully. The supple leather eases around her foot, though still stiff enough to make her tread lightly at first, testing their fit against the promise of a long day. Outside, the world is softened in the half-light. The fields lie quiet as though holding their breath. The path to the well is lined on either side by long grasses, each leaf spangled with dew that glitters faintly in the narrow strip of sky peep between hedge and roof. Mary walks with measured steps, balancing the bucket so that it remains empty, its mouth catching stray droplets of moisture from overhead leaves. She raises one hand to brush aside a low bough of hawthorn, its fragrant blossoms now spent, leaving only the damp scent of earth and blossom stalk behind. At the well, Mary pauses to lean the bucket against the cool stone rim. She draws the rope, its fibers rough under her fingertips, and lowers the bucket into the well's inky depths. The sound as it sinks is a soft whisper, scarcely louder than the rustle of a sleeping cat's tail across the floor. Then she draws slowly, ever so evenly, until the bucket rises heavy with water that gleams darkly in the faint light. The water's surface ripples with her careful touch, and each surge sets free a little bowl of reflected sky. She lifts the bucket off the edge and secures the rope back in a neat coil. Turning, she takes a careful step over the threshold and returns to the cottage, the cool weight of water sloshing quietly at her hip. Inside, her fellow milkmaids have begun their own preparations. Edith flicks embers back to life with a gentle breath, coaxing them into a soft glow. Alice fetches a scrap of clean cloth to dry her shifts. Joan arranges the hearth's remaining wood so that when the day's first bread is to be baked, the flame may be swift to rise. Mary kneels by the hearth and pours the cool water into a wooden trough, stirring it with her hand until it is free of grit. The trough stool stands ready beside their simple dresser. Here they will wash their faces, clear away the last traces of sleep. Each girl takes her turn, wiping her cheeks and neck in gentle strokes, renewing the blood to her cheeks and clearing the eyes of any darkness. A small brass mirror, dulled by years of use, reflects back their pale countenances, eyes brightening now with purpose. When their faces are clean, They stand before the long dresser and slip into linen gowns unstained and freshly laundered. Mary feels the fabric slip across her arms, its coolness a promise of sober work ahead. The linen clings briefly before settling, and she adjusts the bodice, tightening the laces so that her gown will stay close at the waist and not hamper her movements. Beneath, her shift's rough linen sleeves are rolled neatly to her elbows, revealing forearms that have grown accustomed to nightly plunges into churns and troughs. Next come their leather shoes, stout, slightly pointed at the toe and built to endure years on damp pasture. They tie each shoe with deliberate care, ensuring neither lace will loosen during the brisk walk to the cowsheds. The shoes carry a faint scent of tanned hide, mingled with the day's promise of damp grasses and turnip fields. At last, the milkmaids stand as a small line of silent resolve. The pale light growing in the east has not yet warmed the air, and when they step outside, a chill greets them with its open arms. Mary draws in a breath so cold it pricks her lungs, and for a moment she closes her eyes to meet the sensation fully. The hush of dawn is a sacred thing, she thinks, broken only by that single rooster's call and the distant song of hedgerow birds just starting their chorus. They gather their buckets, now refill with fresh water, and step onto the path that leads toward the cowsheds at the edge of the common. Beneath their feet, the dew-damp earth yields slightly, and the leaves of low plants brush their skirts. Each girl walks with careful grace, knowing that the first light of sun may soon reveal their quiet procession. Yet for now they move through a suspended world, neither night nor day, neither sleep nor toil, but a threshold where the milkmaids stand ready to welcome the chores that will shape the hours ahead. In this serene moment, linen lightly rustling, leather creaking in gentle protest, cold air dancing along bare skin, they steel their senses for the labor to come. The quiet breath of the land surrounds them, filled with the promise of fields yet to be tended, of cattle yet to be milked. With hands steadied and spirits attuned to the world's waking pulse, Mary and her companions step forward into the chalice of dawn, ready to draw forth the day's first gift, the soft, white ribbon of milk that will flow into their waiting pails. And in that act, simple, unhurried, and ancient, they become part of the land's first stirring, part of the steady rhythm that will carry them, through churn and hearth and harvest, to the close of this same gentle day. By the time Mary stepped from her cottage door, the first gray wash of dawn had begun to temper the black velvet of night. Her lantern swung softly at her hip, held by a leather strap worn smooth from years of use. The hollow clink of iron hung beneath it, a muted promise of light to come. Mary's breath rose in gentle clouds, each exhalation visible in the cold air that still pressed against the small village at the edge of the commons. There was no hurry, only the patient stirring of those who rose before the world itself had awakened. Behind her, 3 other milkmaids slipped quietly into the hushed lane. Their feet, shod in supple leather shoes fastened with tiny buckles, touched the dirt path with such soft intent that even the scuff of a heel could not disturb the pre-dawn calm. Each carried a simple wooden bucket, newly scrubbed and waiting for the first milk, but for now still empty in their arms. The bucket swung slightly, brass hoops catching stray flickers of lantern light, casting brief sparkles against the thatch and wattle of cottage walls. Above them, the eaves of the cottages hung heavy with dew. Thatched roofs curved in gentle slopes, their straw tips peppered with droplets that seemed to glow faintly, as if tiny stars had fallen and come to rest upon every ridge. As Mary led them past the first row of homes, she noticed how the dew collected into crystalline beads along the rafters, each one trembling in anticipation of a new day's warmth. A few early lanterns peeked from windows, small trembling bulbs of orange, where household fires still smoldered and where other villagers stirred among blankets and wooden stools, preparing for their own labor. Mary paused at a low-hanging hawthorn branch that arched over the lane, its blossoms long since fallen, the bare wood still adorned with thorny twigs. She tilted the lantern just so, and its flame revealed the sharp tips of each thorn against the dim sky. She guided her skirts carefully aside, as though escorting herself through a gate woven of bone-white wood. Behind her, the other girls drew breath, soft exclamations of admiration for Mary's steady hand as she nudged the lantern forward. The wick sputtered once, then caught again, and they all exhaled in unison. Beyond the cluster of thatch, the path opened onto fields stitched with silver lines of dew-laden grass. Each blade seemed to hold the world's patience, waiting for the sun to loosen its clasp. The air smelled faintly of earth and green shoots, as if the soil itself had dreamed through the night and now exhaled a gentle perfume. Mary inhaled deeply, letting the coolness fill her chest, a bracing tonic before the warmth of labor. A soft bleat drifted across the fields, and Mary's head tipped toward the sound. There, ahead and to the right, A lone shepherd trudged along a parallel track. His woolen cloak hung heavy on his shoulders, damp with morning moisture, and his crook tapped softly against a stone wall. When Mary lifted her lantern higher, the shepherd paused. Under the glow, his weathered face relaxed into a polite nod. "A fair morning, Mistress Mary," he whispered, voice low and earthy. To call her mistress was no mockery of title but a gentle deference to her role as the eldest among the milkmaids. "Good morrow, Master Gregson," Mary replied, her voice equally soft. The shepherd's flock, half hidden in gloom, shifted as one when they heard his murmur. Woolly backs rose and fell in a calm rhythm. Master Gregson's eyes crinkled as he offered a quiet greeting to the other girls. One of the younger milkmaids, and by name, dipped her head shyly. Her lantern trembled in her hand, sending dancing reflections over the dew. "Good morrow," she answered in a quieter tenor. Silence settled again, broad and unhurried. The shepherd resumed his slow pace, footsteps deliberate and comforting against the wet grass. Mary watched him go, then signaled to the others. They moved onward, guided now by the scent of fresh grass curling beneath their noses like soft tendrils. The path wound in gentle loops toward the common's edge, where rows of hedgerows and stone walls would soon give way to pastureland and the low buildings of the cowsheds. Along the way, Mary felt the weight of the lantern's handle change in her grasp as daybreak advanced. The flame no longer slipped into a lone finger of light but widened into a modest glow, throwing the world into partial relief. She could now make out the rough-hewn fence posts, dark against the sky, each post joined by ropes of twisted hazel. The fence marked the boundary between settled land and the open common where cows would move from dawn until dusk, fattening on wild grass and clover. The lane curved again, guiding them past a solitary elm whose limbs arched overhead, its bark pale in the hush of dawn. There, dew formed tiny rivulets along the trunk, streaming downward like crystalline tears. Mary paused to steady her breath, for at that moment the world felt as though it held its breath too, in that space between stars and sun, when night hands over its watch to the waking earth. From somewhere beyond the elm a low hum began, the first stirrings of village life. A distant clink of a pail, the faint creak of a door swinging on iron hinges, the rustle of cloth as someone adjusted their gown. The milkmaids listened, heads bowed slightly, as if in respect for the gentle chorus of awakening tasks. Mary allowed herself a small smile, pleased by the soft symphony. It was not loud or insistent, but precious in its subtlety. They reached the brow of a small rise and the cowsheds came into view, a row of low timber-framed buildings, roofs dark with moss, their doorways yawning in quiet invitation. From within, a pale sheen of moisture glimmered along the packed earth floors. Mary set the lantern on a post beside the path and brushed a piece of stray straw from her apron. The other girls gathered close, clustering around her as though seeking warmth and direction. "Stay together," she murmured, her voice rich with calm authority. "We will open each door in turn so no cow starts and breaks free. Let your movements be as gentle as the morning itself." The girls nodded, fingers tightening around bucket handles. Anne's teeth chattered softly, a sign of cold rather than fear. Mary laid a steadying hand on the younger girl's shoulder, pressing warmly through the rough linen. "All is well," she said. "We are exactly where we belong." One by one they crossed the muddy ground and threw open the shed doors. Each door groaned on its hinges, and in that sound lay the promise of the day's work, the patient act of coaxing milk from heavy flanks, the careful tending of animals who entrusted their bounty to human hands. Mary paused at the first stall, allowing her eyes to adjust to the deeper gloom within. She could see the curve of a cow's flank, the soft tuft of her tail, and the rise and fall of her breath. Behind her, a soft shuffle of footsteps, her companions echoing the same reverence in their approach. Mary lifted her lantern again, its wavering glow spilling across oiled beams and revealing buckets already set in neat rows by the stall doors. She breathed deeply, tasting the faint tang of leather, hay, and animal warmth. It was a bouquet as subtle as the dawn itself, a gentle reminder of the bond between land, creature, and caretaker. The girls arranged themselves along the row of cows, each choosing a familiar partner. Mary placed her bucket between her knees, just as she had done every morning for as long as she could remember. She ran her cloth-wrapped hand along the animal's udder, feeling for cleanliness and readiness. Beyond each careful step lay the steady rhythm of milking, gentle pressure, coaxing streams of the first milk from slumbering cattle. But for now, the world retained its hush, a delicate cocoon in which Mary and her fellow milkmaids stood like silent custodians of dawn. In that tranquil moment, Mary allowed her mind to drift forward, toward the next hours. She imagined the pale glow of first light cresting the horizon, the shimmer of fresh pails marching back along the dew-slick path, the slow procession toward the dairy where they would pour the day's yield into the great churn vat. She pictured the echo of wooden buckets on stone floors, the aroma of rich cream awaiting its transformation, and the steady swing of the churn staff that would follow. But first, the hush, the dew, the lantern's glow, and the lowing of cows within their stalls. First, the tender act of gathering the milk that would sustain hearth and table. Mary pressed her hand to the cow's flank, a simple gesture of reassurance, and began the first gentle coax of life's quiet bounty. And as the pale streams of milk curved into the bucket below, the early sun broke free of the horizon, scattering night's last shadows and lighting the path toward another day's steady labor. The pale line of dawn crept slowly across the pasture as Mary and her fellow milkmaids reached the edge of the common. The long night had yielded to the faintest brush of rosy light, the sky a soft wash of lavender and pale gold. In the hush before sunrise, each breath seemed amplified, and every rustle of grass or distant call drifted across the dew-laden meadow. The cows, roused from their long repose, stood in small groups beneath the gnarled oaks and hawthorns, mists clinging to their flanks like filmy veils. A low, gentle chorus of bovine voices rose as the milkmaids approached, an exchange of soft moos and stirring hoofbeats. It was a sound at once familiar and consoling, a reminder that each new day was born in this quiet ceremony of first light and living creatures. Mary paused for a moment on the soft earth, her breath forming a faint mist in the chill air. The leather straps of her shoes were stiff from the night's cold, but the gentle burn in her calves reminded her of purpose. Blue linen trousers and a homespun woolen surcoat did little to shield against the dawn's cool fingers, yet each milkmaid had learned to endure this liminal moment between darkness and day. The dew glistened on the grass, each blade tipped with a bead of silver that caught the burgeoning light. With slow resolve she lifted her lantern, its flame flickering against the horizon, and inhaled the scent of earth gently turning, of grass sweet and wet. Beyond her, Anne and Katerina knelt by a small herd, the wooden pails at their sides. Those pails, turned from seasoned oak and bound with iron hoops, spoke of countless mornings just like this one. They carried the promise of warm porridge by midday, of pots of cream-rich butter and loaves drawn fresh from the hearth. The milkmaids had risen before the sun, and now they prepared to coax the day's first gift from the cattle's soft udders. Stepping forward, Mary chose a gentle cow with mottled brown and white flanks, her great eyes half-lidded with sleep. She rested a hand on the creature's shoulder, murmuring a quiet word as if greeting an old friend. The cow responded with a slow blink and the faint flick of her tail, settling further into the cushion of grass. Mary fetched a small cloth, dipped it into the cold stream that bordered the pasture, and squeezed it until droplets fell back into the water. Then, kneeling, she wiped each teat in turn, removing the night's residue, tiny motes of hay, flecks of dew-damp grass, until her cloth emerged clean. A gentle lowing rose behind her. She glanced up to see Katerina, her sleeves rolled high above pale forearms, repeating the same careful motion. Simple though it was, the act of cleaning the udder was both ritual and necessity, a final tender wash before the yield was drawn. Once the cloth lay aside, Mary shaped her hands around the teats, her fingers quick and practiced. She coaxed the first near-invisible droplet of warm milk, feeling its sheen between thumb and forefinger as she pinched and released. Then came the flood, a steady rhythmic stream white as early fog, coursing into the wooden pail. She kept her back straight, shoulders relaxed, letting her hands dance in that time-worn pattern until the pail beneath her brimmed half full. In the growing light, the milk shone with an opal gleam, the churn of cream already beginning to rise at the surface. Mary glanced across the field to where Anne's pail sat, nearly brimming with her own yield. A ripple of shared satisfaction passed among them, silent encouragement between friends bound by dawn's toil. No words were necessary, each woman understood the steady benevolence of this morning communion. Not every milking went as smoothly. A cow might shift or flick her tail, urging the milkmaid to pause lest she strike a stray fly. Some cattle, roused too suddenly, lumbered sideways, sniffing for the promise of grass rather than hands. Yet the milkmaids worked with quiet confidence, their hands reading each creature's temperament like a secret language. When a stray flick of the hoof threatened the pail's balance, a soft word and a gentle stroke along the cow's neck brought calm. When a subtle tremor ran through the udder, the milkmaid knew to ease her grip, offering steadier pressure. In those early moments, each woman's touch spoke of kindness and skill learned through many seasons of dawn's chill. As Mary drew the last trickle from her pail, she rose to her knees and set it carefully among its fellows, each bucket arranged in a neat row along the dewy grass. The cows, now entirely awake, turned their heads to graze on the tender shoots, undisturbed by the departure of their early visitors. A soft mist curled around the beasts' flanks, drifting away as the sun climbed the sky in a slow, deliberate arc. Mary stood, brushing traces of straw from her skirts, and lifted her gaze eastward. The sun's disk had begun to crown the horizon, flooding the meadow with warmth and color. The milkmaids gathered their pails with careful hands, mindful of the precious liquid within. Wooden yokes lay ready at the path's edge. They positioned each pail with precision, balancing the weight across two shoulders. The path home was firm underfoot now, the morning fully awakened to color and sound. Birds calling from hedgerow, the village chapel bell chiming faintly in the distance, a rooster back at the farmyard greeting the day once more. Step by measured step, the milkmaids shouldered their pails and began the journey toward the dairy. Each wooden pail swayed in time with their gait, the milk gently sloshing but never spilling. In their steadiness lay a promise, of fresh cream to churn, of butter to knead and salt to season. Behind them, the cows resumed their languid breakfast among the dew-laden grass, and the world drew deeper into morning. As Mary moved along the grassy lane, the full process of this dawn ritual settled around her like an old, comforting cloak. The first milking was more than the drawing of milk. It was an act of connection, between creature and caretaker, between darkness and light, between yesterday's labors and today's quiet bounty. With each careful step toward the dairy door, she carried not only the morning's yield but the calm assurance that life's simplest tasks, done together day after day, held a far deeper sweetness than any grand design. The gentle clink of pail against yoke became the music of routine, a lullaby in motion that spoke of steady, unending rhythms, a fitting prelude to the hours that would soon follow, each one unfolding as inevitably and gently as this first milking of dawn. The dawn light filters in pale and tender through a narrow window high in the dairy's thick stone wall. A subdued glow spills across the rough-hewn boards of the workbench, illuminating the simple tools and vessels arrayed for the morning's labors. There is stillness here, broken only by the soft footfalls of the milkmaids as they carry their wooden pails one by one into the cool hush of the dairy. Each pail, heavy with freshly drawn milk, rests for a moment on the smooth plank beside the great churn vat. The echoes of their weight upon stone floors sound distant and muted, a quiet percussion that resonates like a heartbeat in the hush. Mary stands at the center of this calm tableau, her breath visible in the chill air as she lowers her bucket with care. She wipes a stray dew of condensation from her brow and looks about her, noting the gentle wavering of candle flames set along the shelf. The candles, made of tallow rendered from past batches of butter, cast a flickering amber warmth against the cold gray stones. With practiced movement she lays her bucket upright on the plank, its wooden staves worn smooth by countless dawns. A thin line of steam drifts upward from the milk's pale surface. Beside Mary, Anne and Eleanor each slide their pails into place. The three milkmaids form a quiet circle around the churn. They move in unspoken harmony, and reaches for the coarse linen straining cloth, unfolding it slowly, letting its edges brush over the rough beams as she prepares the filtering station. Eleanor holds the churn paddle in one hand, her fingers wrapped around its long, slender handle, the wood polished by years of turning. The vessel itself, a stout wooden vat bound by iron hoops, stands empty and ready, its interior bearing the faint patina of old cream and countless hours of steady work. Mary lifts the first pail, tipping it gently so the milk pours in a thin, steady ribbon through the cloth. A soft gurgle accompanies the flow, and the filtered milk collects in the churn's bowl, clear and pristine. Tiny bits of straw and cattle hair collect in the linen, impurities that would mar the butter's texture, and Anne carefully gathers the cloth by its corners to shake loose the debris into a small bucket destined for the sow. The linen surface is cool and damp in her hands. A few drops of milk cling to the cloth's threads, sighing as they spread into the weave. The second pail is set down. Its owner pauses to smooth the cloth over the churn's rim, adjusting the folds so every measure of cream will pass through. Mary pours again, the hush deepening as the other milkmaids exchange quiet whispers. They speak in low tones of simple comforts. A child's laugh from the cottage yard, the slow burn of embers in the hearth at home, the promise of a midday meal when all their labor will pause for a moment's rest. These murmured confidences form a tapestry of companionship, each thread strengthening the bond between them. Above their heads, the single window frames a strip of sky still brushed in mauve and gray. The chill slips through the panes, carried on a gentle draft that pushes past the churn vat and stirs the corners of the room. Eleanor closes her cloak tighter about her shoulders as she lifts the third pail. She takes a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of fresh milk mingled with the mossy tang of stone. She tips the vessel with a steady hand, the milk flows forth in a silent arc. A bead of liquid schemes the rim of the churn, then lands with a whispering patter, joining the cream that already swirls within. When the final pail empties, Mary folds the cloth and lays it aside on the plank, where it will rest until its next use. The three milkmaids stand in a small tableau of stillness. Before them, the churn vat holds the sum of their early morning toil, pale, frothy cream that glimmers dully in the candlelight. It is a simple thing, but to these women it carries weight, promise of nourishing butter to spread on bread, of coins to be earned at market, of the quiet pride that comes from honest work. Now comes the time for the next motion, the steady rhythm of churning. Mary takes the paddle first, seating it firmly in the center of the vat. She braces her foot against the stone floor, plants her hands upon the shaft, and pushes forward in a measured sweep. The paddle plows through the cream with a low, resonant sound, a murmur like distant surf upon a pebbled shore. And Eleanor watch her for a moment and then fall into the same motion. Together, the three press and pull, each stroke identical in length and pace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the cream thickens. It sighs and weeps, little rivulets of buttermilk seeping past the paddle's edge and collecting in minute pools at the bottom of the vat. Their breathing settles into a gentle cadence, matching the churn's song. No words are needed now, the rhythm guides their muscles and their minds drift to other gentle images. Eleanor thinks of the quiet coolness of the common before dawn, grass beaded with dew, the scent of clover, and recalls the hush of her mother's lullaby sung softly in the candlelit kitchen. Mary imagines the day ahead, the sun climbing higher, lighting thatch roofs in gold, the chatter of townsfolk gathering their purchases. After what feels like an age, and wipes her brow with the back of her hand and notices the change in the cream's texture. It clings in pale clumps along the paddle's edges, heavier now. She signals Mary by lifting her free hand slightly, fingertip poised. Mary slows her rhythm, senses the transformation. The cavernous vat begins to feel heavy under the mass of butter forming within. A light sheen of translucent buttermilk pools at the surface, glistening in the wavering light. At Mary's word, they cease their motions. Eleanor lifts the paddle, bracing it beneath her arm to catch any stray lumps. They strain the buttermilk away through the linen once more, letting it drip into a small bowl for the household's bread and the sow. The butter, pale gold marbled with white, remains behind, a yield born of muscle and patience. With wooden paddles they fold and press the lumps, rinsing them in cool water carried from the well, pressing out the last of the lingering liquid. The stones beneath their feet grow warmer as the candles gutter. The dairy's silence has shifted from a chill hush to something softer, suffused with the gentle satisfaction of a task completed. The three milkmaids arrange the butter on a clean wooden board, shaping it into small rounds and logs that will be wrapped in cloth and sold at market. They share a quiet smile, each woman's eyes reflecting the glow of the simple feast they have conjured from milk and early morning hours. And as the sky brightens outside, shifting from lavender to rose and gold, the dairy remains a sanctuary of calm. Here, the echoes of their steps and the murmur of their voices will carry into the chapters ahead, guiding the pace of kneaded dough, glowing hearth fires, and dawns yet to come. In this moment, the milkmaids stand together, steady and content, their early hours' labor laid bare in the gentle form of butter, soft, placid, and brimming with quiet promise. The dairy's low arched doorway stood open to the first pale light of dawn, and within its cool shadows a great oaken churn waited. Its iron bands were dark with age, its staves smooth and worn from 100 winters of toil. A hush lay upon the stone floor, broken only by the soft shuffling of leather shoes and the faint, steady drip of leftover cream trickling from a wooden pail's lip. The air smelled of earth and something sweet, yesterday's fresh milk, now cooled overnight into a thick layer of cream, waiting to be transformed. Mary moved in silence to the churn's side, her linen sleeves rolled above slender wrists. Flicking a strand of hair from her face, she lifted a wooden pail with slow care. Her fellow milkmaid Agnes stood ready beside a low bench, where a shallow bowl of clean water and a scrap of linen cloth had been set. Mary tipped the pail gently, the cream slid out in rich, slow globs, pooling around the churn staff like pale honey. A few stray drops spattered softly against the stone, but there was no hurry. This morning was all about measured rhythm and quiet attention. The staff of the churn, carved from ash and worn to a warm patina, stood upright in the vat. Mary's grip was firm but relaxed. She placed her other hand on the side of the churn for balance. Just beyond her, ribbons of dawn light filtered through a small window slit, spilling amber upon the damp floor and making the cream gleam. Agnes reached forward, dipped a finger into the cream, and drew it against her lips to taste its sweetness. She nodded, barely audible, and Mary set her jaw, readying herself for the first swing. Back and forth the staff moved, each stroke almost imperceptibly smooth. The sound it made, a low, continuous sigh, filled the little dairy and seemed to echo against the curved ceiling. Mary's arm muscles began their slow effort, the motion guided by long habit rather than force. At first the cream merely swirled like slow water around a stone. Then, after a few dozen strokes, a faint foaming emerged at the surface, white as new-lain wool. Mary glanced down, her heart lifting at the sight. Agnes took her place at the side bowl. As Mary churned, every so often Agnes scooped out a little of the drained liquid. The buttermilk, a translucent amber, spilled into the shallow bowl with a soft splash. Mary kept her gaze steady on the churn's rim, on the line between cream and foam, listening to the changing cadence. The staff moving through liquid, the liquid shifting, the staff moving again. The dull thud on the bottom of the vat gave way to a slightly sharper knock as air pockets formed. Then came a tiny, almost musical clinking, cream solids beginning to gather. It took 4 full minutes of steady work before the foam yielded to tiny grains. Mary felt the churn's weight shift under her hands. She paused, carefully lifted the staff and let the mixture settle. The surface was now dotted with faint yellow glimmers, like fireflies trapped in swirls of white. Agnes leaned over and whispered, "See how you have them, Mary? Gold in the making." Mary closed her eyes for a moment and drew a slow breath. In this quiet hour, the world outside seemed far off. They resumed. Mary's arms kept their gentle forward and backward beat, almost like the soothing cadence of a lullaby. With each set of 10 strokes, the grains grew larger, the sound changed from a soft hiss to a richer, more textured murmur. The milkmaids felt the churn's increased resistance, a sign that solid butter was coalescing. Sweat gathered at Mary's hairline, but her expression remained calm. She worked as though moving through water, each gesture measured, intentional. Agnes now began to strain the last drops of buttermilk. She held the bowl under the spout by the churn's side, catching every golden drop. The bowl, already half full, grew heavier in her lap. Occasionally she lifted a handful of the frothy surface, testing with gentle pressure between her fingers. With quiet satisfaction, she returned the cream to the churn for Mary's next strokes. The low throbbing of their combined labors filled the dairy, joined by distant birdsong and the wind sighing through hawthorn boughs beyond the cottage walls. Time lost its grip. 10 minutes here measured not by a clock but by the steady change from foam to grains, from grains to solid clumps. Mary slowed only when the churn began to feel sluggish, when she sensed the last watery rings diminish. Then she stopped, lifted the churn staff and turned her head to Agnes. The small bowl beside her brimmed with pale, almost clear buttermilk. On the churn's bottom lay a pale yellow mass, ragged in shape but unmistakably butter. Agnes rose and took the staff. She twisted it between her hands, gently coaxing the butter from the staves and sides, loosening it into a single lump. Mary knelt and slid the staff free, carefully setting it aside. With 2 wooden paddles, flattened and smooth at the ends, they began to gather the butter, pulling it together like kneading clay. The lump felt cool, firm yet pliant. Its scent was faintly sweet, sunlit and comforting. They worked to expel the last of the buttermilk, folding and pressing until the butter felt satiny. All at once they paused, faces close to the golden mass. For a moment, time was held in a single breath. Then Agnes smiled and let out a quiet laugh. The butter gleamed in her palms, a promise of crusty bread and savory spreads to come. They dipped a finger into the small bowl of buttermilk and tasted it, tart, refreshing, a testament to the churn's slow alchemy. Mary lifted the lump and placed it on a board strewn with coarse salt crystals. With light, even pressure, she worked the salt into the butter, folding it over and over until the grains dissolved and the butter felt smooth once more. Agnes brushed her sleeve across a patch of the board and they set the butter down, shaping it into 2 small rectangular blocks. Their movements were unhurried, deliberate, each gesture part of a ritual passed down through generations of milkmaids who rose before dawn to witness this quiet miracle. A pale sunbeam now touched the butter's surface, turning it almost luminous. Across the dairy floor, stray beams played upon the walls, revealing faint chalk marks where last week's milk yields had been tallied. Outside, a sparrow fluttered against the window pane, and in that light Mary saw the world beyond their steady labors, fields green with promise, towns waking, hearth fires kindling across the land. With a final nod, Mary and Agnes stood back. The churn had completed its work. The The buttermilk, sweet and nourishing, would be used later for baking or to cool parched throats. The butter, rich and golden, would travel tomorrow to the market, to be spread on thick slices of bread, to be eaten by traveling merchants, by shepherds, by mothers and their children who awaited it. It was simple magic born of cream, motion, and patience. They gathered their tools, the churn staff, the bowl, the paddles, and carried them to the wide trough by the door. A clear spring of well water awaited there, and one by one they rinsed each piece, letting the cool flow wash away every smear of butter. Outside, as they tipped the water from the tub, the first dozen hens began to stir in the yard. Somewhere a clock tower chimed the hour, somewhere else a woodcutter lifted his axe. Mary paused at the threshold, looking back into the dairy. The empty churn stood ready for the day's next labor. The wooden boards still bore the faint sheen of churned butter. She breathed in the memory of its sweet aroma and felt a quiet pride in what had been wrought here by simple hands and steady resolve. Turning, she stepped out into the pale morning, the promise of fresh loaves and warm hearths already taking shape in her mind. Ahead lay the hearth oven, faint embers still glowing beneath its stones. The air filled now with the mingled scents of wood smoke, milk, and wild thyme that had drifted in from the commons. Mary lifted her skirts to walk on, each footfall deliberate, each breath shared with her companions. The churn's triumph would soon become bread's foundation, and in that seamless flow of labor and warmth the day would unfold. Thus, with butter made and spirits lifted, the milkmaids set their faces toward the hearth, ready to coax the oven back to life and begin the next quiet chapter of their ancient craft. As the last lumps of butter were gathered into wooden bowls and the bright swirl of buttermilk drained away, Mary and her fellow milkmaids turned their attention to the bakery's heart, the great stone hearth that would soon cradle the day's first loaves. Outside, the cool glow of dawn had settled into a gentle amber that filtered through mullioned windows, striking motes of flour and dust into momentary brilliance. Within the low-ceilinged room, the hush was broken only by the quiet scrape of leather shoes on rough-hewn boards and the faint echo of churn paddles set carefully aside. In this chamber of warmth, the ritual of firing the oven was about to begin. First, Mary approached the store beneath the counter where kindling and small logs lay in neat bundles. The space was cool and dim, but the small store smelled sharp and fragrant. The scent of split oak mingled with the sweeter perfume of ash from the previous night's embers. Kneeling, she lifted armfuls of slender sticks, each no thicker than her wrist, laying them gently onto a broad tray. Her fingers brushed away stray chips of bark as she worked, careful to keep the slender wood dry and ready to ignite at the hearth's threshold. Behind her, her companion and passed larger pieces of seasoned beech, stacking them in a crisscross pattern on the tray so that air could breathe between the logs once they were laid before the fire. The four milkmaids moved in silent harmony, like hands of a clock, each knowing her part. Elizabeth carried the tray from the store and paused at the hearth, setting it on the wide lintel. The hearth yawned before her, a dark mouth lined with charred stone, shadowed and cool. Hastily she opened the wrought iron door, its hinges creaking softly, and peered inside. Faint ribbons of smoke still clung to the blackened rear wall where glowing embers lay thick among scattered coals. These embers, the remains of last night's fire, held the spark they would soon coax to life. Next, Mary retrieved a small bellows from a peg near the door. Its leather folds were supple with age, and its spout was ringed with iron. With a few measured pumps, she guided a steady breeze into the embers, watching them flare to momentary brilliance. A warm breath of air whispered across the hearth, lifting motes of ash and stirring the mellow glow that lay deep in the coals. The low hiss of escaping smoke seemed to sigh in relief, as if welcoming the return of warmth after the chill of early morning. Once the embers shone bright, the milkmaids arranged their kindling in a conical pile atop the coals. First the slender sticks, then the crisscrossed beech, and finally a few heavier logs Mary selected for their dry honey-colored grain. She crouched before the hearth, her linen sleeves rolled to her elbows, and cupped her hands around a small pinch of dried grass, the spark that would ignite the kindling. Holding it with practiced care, she drew a charcoal-stained flint against steel until a spray of sparks danced into the grass. A thin wisp of flame curved upward, and she guided it to the base of the pile, breathing gently until the flame blossomed. With the kindling of flame, the milkmaid set aside the bellows. Elizabeth picked up a slender iron poker, its handle worn smooth by countless turns. She prodded and shifted the newly lit pile, guiding the firebed so that it would burn up the smaller sticks first, then leap eagerly onto the heavier logs. Each motion was measured, her arms steady as she directed the warmth to spread evenly across the hearth's base. The sound was elemental, the crackle of resinous wood, the dull thump as larger branches settled, and the whisper of smoke rising through the flue above. At Mary's side and adjusted a nearby shovel, scooping a handful of coals and shifting them closer to the kindling. A stray ember sparked against the iron, and Mary leaned forward to catch its flight with a calloused finger, dropping it safely onto a patch of bare stone. The interior of the hearth glowed in gentle waves, the shadows dancing across its curved back like water caught in a moonbeam. Already the flames reached upward, licking at the caverned roof, and a gentle heat began to roll out into the room, banishing the last hints of pre-dawn chill from the corners. Yet the wood weaved its own rhythm, and once the logs had settled into a steady burn, the milkmaids knew it was time to turn their attention to the oven's mouth. Across from the hearth, a small arched door led into the fire chamber where loaves would soon bake. But first, this chamber needed seasoning by coals that would climb its walls, blackening the interior and leaving just enough whisper of ash to tame the heat. With deft fingers, Mary opened the oven door and reached into the hearth with the poker, sliding it gently along the floor until it struck buried coals. She drew them forth one by one, arranging them on the oven's stone hearth so that they would clamber out of the firebox and into the baking chamber. Each coal was coaxed across, the poker's point curled beneath it, then lifted in a steady arc so that it would fall into place with a muted hiss. The procession continued, ember after ember, until the oven hearth lay aglow with coals, like a bed of smoldering rubies. Mary closed the baking chamber's door and returned to the hearth, where the logs now crackled in full. A tender warmth seeped out, wrapping around her ankles like a cozy cloak. She paused for a moment, inhaling the mingled scents of burning wood and warmed stone. All at once, she felt the hush of pre-dawn yield to the comforting promise of warmth, of loaves soon to rise, of a day not yet begun but already held close by this elemental warmth. But the final test remained. The oven's true temperature must be known before dough dared its depths. Elizabeth fetched a small bundle of wheat flour, scooping out a pinch on her palm. With delicate care, she held her hand near the oven's door, letting a wisp of flour trickle toward the cool stone inside. She closed her eyes for a soft moment, listening to the faint hiss as the flour met the heat, watching through half-lidded lids as it browned gently. A thin arc of pale dust dusted the interior, enough to leave a light tan shade on her palm. Opening her eyes, she judged the color with practiced patience. If the flour blanched but did not burn to charcoal, the temperature was right. Too pale, and it needed more time. Too dark, and she would have to coax the oven down with a crack of the door and by shifting some coals back to the hearth. This morning's test was perfect. The flour trace glowed a light biscuit hue, the sign that the oven lay ready. Mary signaled to Anne, who closed the oven door and returned to fetch the baking peel, a broad wooden board smooth from years of sliding loaves in and out of fiery chambers. Together they stood before the hearth, feeling the full breadth of its warming glow. The hush of the bakery transformed into a quiet anticipation, a gentle tremor of promise. Soon, the pale dough rested and risen, would be shaped, scored, and slid into this very throat of stone, where time and heat would work their quiet alchemy. For now, though, the hearth stood fired and patient, its warmth rising in gentle waves. The milkmaids drew back, wiping their palms on the hems of their gowns, savoring the rising heat. A hush fell again, broken only by the drip of a small bead of sweat from Mary's forehead and the soft sigh of flames that had at last found their voice. In that moment, as the hearth flared bright, the day truly began, an unhurried promise of crusts and crumb, of simple labor and lasting nourishment. And as they stepped back, lit by that warming glow, the milkmaids carried in their hearts the calm assurance that the first loaves would soon emerge golden, steadfast as the dawn itself. Before the first rest of the dough, the quiet of the dairy oven room is gentle and assured. The hearth's embers glow behind iron bars, lending a steady warmth that presses softly against chilled cheeks. From the small window, pale morning light filters in, touching every beam of the low ceiling with dusty silver. On the rough-hewn counter, a broad wooden kneading trough stands ready, its oaken planks smooth from years of use. Within it, a shallow pile of pale flour waits like powdered snow upon a mountaintop. In the hush, Mary crosses the flagstones toward the trough, her leather shoes muted by the woolen hem of her skirt. Two other milkmaids linger behind her, each bent slightly as if in deference to a sacred rite. All four have emerged from the hearth-tended glow with renewed purpose, to transform simple grain and water into supple life. Mary lifts the linen cloth that once covered bowls of sourdough starter, its fibers dusted faintly with flour residue. The cloth's fold reveals small bubbles of fermented dough, fragrant with a gentle tang and a whisper of yeast's secret promise. The starter, coaxed from yesterday's leavings, awaits its joining with fresh grains. Mary teases a spoonful from the bowl, soft and yielding between thumb and finger, and lays it atop the white mound in the trough. A soft exhalation of warmth drifts upward, mingling with the hearth's lingering smoke. The milkmaids watch in silence as though the moment demands reverence. With a modest lift of her wrist, Mary takes a small hand sieve, its wire mesh taut and even. She holds it above the trough and draws flour through its fine net in a measured rhythm. Each dusting drifts slowly downward, a quiet cascade that settles atop the starter in a pale uniform layer. The soft patter of flour grains is almost inaudible within the room's stillness, yet each tiny impact seems to echo in the heart. White motes swirl in the air, caught in sunbeams, drifting like minute butterflies. The milkmaids exchange glances, mindful of the flour dust that settles on their dark hair and ruddy cheeks. When the last servo of flour has passed through the sieve, Mary sets the sieve aside and traces a finger through the flour, forging a shallow well at the trough's center. The hollow is ready to receive the warmed water drawn moments earlier from the hearth's copper kettle. Close to the fire, the iron kettle had stood, its broad belly steamed and hissed with the infusion of warmth. Mary poured measured water from its lip into a wooden cup carved smooth by years of service, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Now she brings the cup to the trough. Hands steady, she pours in the water in thin arcs, first a trickle into the flour's well, then a gentler stream around the edges, coaxing the flour to absorb the heat. A faint hiss rises as the warmth meets the white powder, and the flour begins to clump in delicate beads. Wisps of steam drift upward, curling in the air before being drawn toward the hearth. The warmth tickles Mary's fingertips through the wood. At her left, and positions herself with a small wooden measure of fine salt. She lifts the measure and taps it lightly against her palm until the salt grains loosen and fall. A whisper of crystals drifts onto the dampening flour mound. Though modest in quantity, the salt is essential, an unseen hand that restrains the dough's wanderlust, balancing sweetness with a shy strength. Anne's eyes soften as she pushes the measure away, and she folds her hands at her waist, anticipation stirring in her chest. Now the kneading begins. Mary cups one palm beneath the other and presses her thumbs firmly into the flour-water sourdough stock. Beneath her fingers, the dough gathers in sticky folds. She slides her fingers to one side and pushes the mass outward, stretching it into an ovoid shape. Each push requires just enough force to coax the dough's nature into pliability, yet not so much that it tears. A gentle symphony issues from the trough, the low scrape of wood against soft dough, the quiet slap of pinched edges. Nearby, Anne brings a bowl of flour to the edge of the counter and dips her hand into its snowy depths. She scoops a handful and dusts the dough's surface, sprinkling white granules that glint like frost. The little cloud of flour drifts through the air before settling upon the dough's topmost crest. The added flour prevents clinging, granting the dough its freedom to stretch. Mary tucks her forearms against the trough's edge and draws the dough back over itself, folding layers inward like turning pages of a thick manuscript. The mass tightens beneath her touch, coaxing out invisible strength. Its texture shifts beneath her palms, first sticky and uncertain, then firming with each fold. 1 hour before, they had coaxed the hearth into life. Now, while the embers still glow, the dough emerges transformed under practiced hands. Each fold releases little puffs of air, a sibilant sigh that betrays the yeast's hidden labors. Mary continues, the rhythm of her kneading unhurried. Press, fold, turn, press, fold, turn, a steady tide that surges and retreats within the wooden trough. The milkmaids chant softly to themselves, soft ballads of childhood health or lines of distant prayers learned in their mother's kitchen, so that the dough may absorb the calm and the grace of gentle voices. Occasionally Mary pauses to test the dough's strength. She lifts a small piece and stretches it between two thumbs, watching the thin membrane form before it breaks. The test reveals the dough's progress. Under 30 folds, the gluten has begun to mesh, threads of elasticity shimmering just beneath the surface. She nods in quiet satisfaction and returns the scrap to the trough, burying it within the bulk to continue its silent training. As the kneading proceeds, the hush of the dairy oven room yields a faint chorus of pastoral sounds. Beyond the door, a cowbell rings out on the common, then recedes across misty fields. A distant crow caws, overlapped by the muted laughter of children at play in the village lane. The warmth from the hearth mellows the crispness of the air, drawing a faint scent of wood smoke and fresh hay into the thresholds of consciousness. Even through the closed door, the world feels alive, but here, within this small sanctuary, time slows. At length, Mary gathers the dough into a smooth, round melody of soft pale leather. She brushes her skirt hem against the trough's edge to clear stray flour and raises the pliant sphere, cupping it gently in both hands. The dough is warm now, supple and smooth, its surface taut but yielding to a gentle touch. As she sets it back into the trough, and retrieves the linen cloth, thin, well-used and lightly dusted with flour, she fluffs it out, ensuring no seam will imprint upon the dough's rising form. Draped over the trough, the cloth seals in the warmth and protects the dough from the drafts that slip under the door. Mary turns to check the hearth's embers. A quick shift of the cast iron poker redirects the coals, channeling heat steadily without burning the trough's edge. The dough, snug under its cloth, glows faintly through the linen, an unseen warmth that promises life within the pale mass. In that hallowed silence, even the simple cloth takes on a soft holiness, guarding in its folds the quiet miracle of fermentation yet to bloom. The milkmaids step back, leaving space around the trough. Their shoulders relax. They share a glance, a communal sigh of completion. Today's dough, like all doughs nurtured before it, will rest here for its first proof. Soon, under this cloak of warmth, it will swell and breathe, doubling in bulk as yeast waken from slumber. And in that rising will lie the day's promise: golden loaves, crisp crusts, and tender crumb. Mary dims the flame of a nearby lantern, leaving only the room's natural light to hold vigil. In a soft voice, she murmurs an old rhyme of thanks for simple gifts: flour, water, fire, and time. Her words are carried by a current of stillness, felt more than heard. Behind the door, the world moves toward its midday tasks, but here, in this moment preserved, the milkmaids savor the quiet confidence of work well begun. The first proof will follow, but for now the dough rests. Under linen folds and gentle heat, it dreams of its shape yet to come. And in the hush that holds them all, the milkmaids pause, their hearts as full as the trough beside them, ready for whatever the morning may bring. The pale light of early morning still lingers at the edges of the dairy, where wooden beams arch overhead and the air holds a gentle warmth left by the hearth's fading embers. In this quiet nook, Mary and her fellow milkmaids gather around the broad kneading trough, its surface lightly dusted with pale flour. The day's first labors, rising before dawn, milking the cows, churning butter, firing the hearth, and kneading the dough, have been carried out with the steady rhythm of well-worn routine. Now, in this calm interlude, they prepare the dough for its first proof, a time of waiting, reflection, and quiet hope that the simple mixture of flour, water, salt, and starter will swell into the soft promise of loaves to come. Each woman sets aside her work for a moment, wiping flour-dusted hands on her linen gown. The trough, filled with the supple, elastic mass, sits ready. One by one, they lift a clean cloth, once more sifted through flour to ensure it will not cling, and lay it gently over the dough's rounded surface. As the cloth settles, it releases a faint cloud of white dust that drifts to the plank floor before settling into the grasp of a stray sunbeam through the low window. The cloth's fibers capture just enough flour to guard the dough from drying, while still permitting it to breathe and expand. Mary steps forward to guide the trough into its warm niche, a shallow recess carved beside the baking hearth. Here, the stones have retained heat through the night, glowing faintly beneath layers of ash. She feels the warmth against her fingertips as she aligns the trough so that it sits level, far enough from the oven's mouth to avoid scorching, yet close enough to catch the gentle radiance of residual heat. The other milkmaids form a loose circle, their breathing slow and even, as though they too will hold their breath until the dough begins its silent work. For a moment, the only sound is the soft crackle of the dying hearth and the hush of breath passing between them. A single lantern, hung from a twisted iron hook overhead, casts a pool of amber light across the scene, illuminating flecks of flour caught in the warm air. Each milkmaid stands still, hands clasped, as though the very motion might disturb the yeast's subtle stirring. Their faces are calm, eyes half closed, caught in the gentle glow as they wait. Yet inside the trough, unseen currents swirl. Tiny bubbles of carbon dioxide push against the dough's inner walls, unseen hands coaxing it to life. Over the next hour, minute by minute, the dough will creep upward, broadening against its wooden confines. To the untrained eye, the change may appear imperceptible at first, only a slight rounding of the edges, a softer resistance to the fingertips' touch. But to these women who have learned to read every nuance of texture and temperature, it is as clear as dawn's first blush, the promise of bread unfolding. Mary lowers herself to a kneeling posture by the hearth, leaning close enough to feel the damp warmth emerging from the trough. She breathes in the faint scent of fermenting grains, mingled with the smoke and ash of the hearth. A bead of sweat gathers at her temple from the residual heat, though the air beyond the hearth remains cool and still. She lets her palm rest lightly on the edge of the trough, as though to reassure the dough that it may rise in peace. By her side, Agnes, the youngest of the milkmaids, murmurs a soft word of encouragement as if to a child, "Grow strong, my heart. Yield golden crust and tender crumb." Her tone is not mockery, but a genuine affection for this living mass of sustenance. Another, Isabel, brushes a stray curl of hair back from her forehead, then glances around the dairy. She notes the faint outlines of baskets, churn paddles laid aside, and the cleaned hearth tools leaning against the wall. Each instrument, each surface, stands ready for the next stage once the dough has proved. Time drifts by gently. The women settle into small comforts while they wait. One retrieves a ladle to sip lingering buttermilk left in a bowl, another smooths the hem of her dress and listens to the distant crow of a stray rooster. The hush in the dairy feels sacred, as though they have stepped momentarily from the world of toil into a chamber of quiet reflection. In this suspended hour, they are neither milking nor baking, but guardians of a simple miracle, the alchemy by which flour, water, and time become bread. Little by little, the dough's surface begins to betray its transformation. The cloth's edges lift just enough to show the pale, rounded mound pressed against the trough's sides. When Mary reaches out and presses a fingertip into the dough, it yields with a gentle spring, leaving a shallow indentation that slowly fills back in. "See now," she whispers, "how it has grown and gives." A soft murmur ripples through the circle, not of idle chat, but of shared reverence. The light by the hearth shifts as the sun climbs higher, sending a warm beam across the dairy floor. Where the sun touches the cloth, the faintest sheen of moisture appears, the dough breathing beneath its cover, releasing tiny drops of condensation. Mary pulls back a corner of the cloth to peer close, careful not to disturb the veil of flour. She observes the pattern of small bubbles straining against the fabric, each one a sign of the yeast's diligent work. As the hour wanes, the women prepare themselves for the next movement in their steady dance, shaping, scoring, and baking the loaves that will feed the village. But in this moment, they savor the soft stillness and the patient swell of the dough. Here, at the threshold between effort and reward, they find a simple contentment. The hearth's afterglow warms their faces, the gentle rhythms of their breathing sync with the dough's measured rise, and for a brief time the world outside may as well be asleep. At last, Mary draws a slow breath and looks to her friends. Her voice is low, yet carries an undercurrent of quiet pleasure. "Soon we shall shape, my dears," she says. "But now let us rest in this gentle promise." The others nod, some closing their eyes for a moment, others tracing invisible patterns on the worn plank floor. In the hush of the dairy, with first proof achieved, they feel the soft reassurance that another day of labor, of hands pressed to dough and hearth, will yield its nourishing reward. Thus ends the first chapter of Waiting and Becoming. Soon, in the chapters that follow, the milkmaids will shape the swelled dough into rustic loaves and tender rolls, score each crust, and send them into the fiery heart of the oven. But in this calm interlude, they hold fast to the simple wonder of rising dough, a humble testament to patience, to craft, and to the quiet miracle that unfolds when flour and water meet the gentle warmth of a Tudor morning. Morning light, pale and wavering, filters through the mullioned window of the dairy bakery, casting slanted bars of gentle radiance across the dusty floorboards. The air, still heavy with the faint warmth of the hearth's afterglow, carries the mingled sense of fermenting dough and honeyed buttermilk. Mary and her fellow milkmaids move quietly about the work table, each bent in reverent concentration upon the soft, yielding mounds of dough that have risen overnight in the trough. Their simple linen sleeves are rolled back, and the pale skin of their forearms bears a fine sheen of flour. A hush, broken only by the soft susurration of hushed words and the distant crackle of coals, settles over the room as the shaping begins. First, the work surface must be made ready. Mary dips her hand into a shallow wooden basin filled with the finest flour, ground from barley and wheat in the watermill down the lane. She lifts a gentle handful, letting the pale grains fall in a fine, drifting snowfall across the broad plank of oak. She works the flour into a thin, even layer, guiding it with a practiced fingertip until the whole expanse is dusted white. This simple act, coating the table in that soft layer, feels almost ceremonial. Every surface must be prepared so that no parcel of dough, tender and full of air, will stick and tear in the shaping process. Her fingers glide across the table, gathering loose motes of flour and stirring them into the wood's grain. In the dim lantern light, the board seems to glow with an inner softness, a cradle for the yielding loaves. A secondary basin, smaller and shaped from turned maple, holds clean water. Mary dips a cloth in that water and dabs at the board's edge, removing stray patches of dough or smears of sticky residue. By the time she steps back, the table stands bright and pure, ready to receive the dough's next incarnation. From the flour-dusted trough, Mary lifts the first swollen mass of risen dough. It yields beneath her palms, plump and buoyant, its surface dimpled by tiny gas bubbles that promise lightness and spring. The dough feels cool to the touch, almost like ivory stone, yet alive with hidden warmth and possibility. Mary divides it with a wooden scraper, cutting through the soft dome with a measured sweep. The blade slides almost effortlessly, revealing the dough's feathery interior, streaked with strands that gleam in the lantern's glow. With a brief nod to Anne, who stands ready with a second handful of flour, Mary transfers one piece of dough to the work surface. There, she begins the delicate art of coaxing it into shape. She presses her palms gently upon the soft mass, folding its edges inward toward the center, rolling it softly along the board so that each fold layers upon the next. The dough, pliant and forgiving, takes on a smooth, rounded form under her guiding hands. Each movement is slow, precise. Press, fold, rotate, seal. The surface grows taut and sheeny, tension building beneath her deft fingertips. When the round loaf stands firm, Mary sets it aside on a lightly floured part of the table and fetches another portion. This one, she decides, will become a coil roll. Pinching off a slender length, she rolls it between her palms, coaxing it into a soft rope of even thickness. Then, with the tip held steady on the board, she loops the rope around itself, twining it into a spiral that resembles a tiny snail's shell. The coil deepens with each turn, and Mary presses the end firmly into the side of the roll so that it will hold its shape as it bakes. The little coil sits nestled in its curves, a perfectly formed brioche-like shape awaiting the hearth. A third piece of dough is destined to be plated. Mary sets it down and, with gentle force, stretches it into a long strand. She dusts the board lightly again, preventing any stick. Then she splits it into 3 equal ribbons, each pliant under her fingers. With steady rhythm, she crosses the left strand over the center, then the right over the new center, crossing left and right in turn, a slow, deliberate dance of dough that yields a neat, elongated plate. When the braid reaches its end, Mary tucks the final lengths beneath the loaf, pinching them closed so that the braid remains secure. The finished plate resembles a simple crown, humble and whole. While Mary shapes and readies the wooden peel boards by wiping them with a linen cloth and scattering a light flourish of bran, enough to let the loaves slip free once baked. The boards are warm and smooth under Anne's fingers, faintly scented of wood smoke and the residue of yesterday's loaf. Mary transfers each finished shape onto its assigned peel. Round loaves occupy one board, braided plates another, coil rolls a third. She spaces them with care, leaving room for each to swell and breathe in the oven. Their pale surfaces gleam softly, still moist from the shaping. Next comes the gentle brushing of the tops. Mary pours a measure of buttermilk into a shallow wooden cup, thin and streaked with the pale gold of cream. With a soft bristle brush, one trimmed from hog hair and bound to a slender willow handle, she scoops up the liquid and glides it across each loaf. The brush strokes are deliberate, smoothing the buttermilk into every crease and along each braided ridge. The light wash will encourage a deep, golden crust and lend a faint tang of sweetness to the bread surface. With each sweep, Mary can feel the warmth of the dough through the bristles, a subtle thrum of life beneath her hand. The hush of the room deepens as all the milkmaids pause to admire the assembled loaves. Lines of perfect coils, braids, and rounded forms stand in neat rows, like ornamental hedges awaiting a grand feast. The peels, weighted lightly with their burden, rest at ready near the oven's mouth. The hearth fire, fed with split logs and glowing embers, flickers brightly within. Outside, the morning sun has climbed higher, promising the warmth to come, but inside this room the air remains cool, ideal for setting the shaped dough. Mary takes a slow breath, inhaling the sweet, yeasty fragrance that rises from the loaves. The scent is thick with promise of warmth, of crust that crackles under a knife, of crumbs that scatter like pale dust on a wooden table. She exchanges a glance with Anne, and without a word they know it is time to slide the peels into the hearth. And extends her arm, guiding the edge of the peel beneath a round loaf. With a gentle tug back, the loaf slips free and glides into the oven's radiant cavity. The heat welcomes it with a soft hiss, and the crust begins to set almost at once. One by one each board is offered to the hearth. The coil rolls find their niche along one wall of the oven, their spirals catching the light of embers. The braided plates nestle against the glowing bricks at the back. And the humble rounds take proud positions in the center, ready to puff and brown. Ashes fall, but Mary's deft arm brushes them aside, ensuring a clean hearth for the loaves to bake. As the final loaf disappears into the warm gloom, Mary withdraws the empty peels and rests them against the wall. The room, once cluttered with dough and flour, grows still again, awaiting the miraculous transformation that will occur over the next hour. The milkmaids tidy their boards, scooping excess flour back into the trough, gathering stray dough scraps to feed once more to the miller's goats. Outside, the distant church bell tolls the next hour, a soft summons that echoes through the morning mist. Here, in the cool hush following the shaping, Mary feels a quiet contentment. The rhythm of the morning labor, milking, churning, kneading, and now shaping, carries in its steady cadence a deep, abiding peace. Each loaf, each coil and braid, is an echo of centuries of hands that have toiled in kitchens much like this, forging sustenance from the simple gifts of grain and water. In these shapes lies the promise of nourishment for hungry villagers, the warmth of hearth and home, and the unbroken thread of tradition that binds each day to the next. Soon, the first crusts will crackle with steam as bread emerges golden and fragrant from the hearth. But for now, in this quiet in-between, Mary and her sisters rest their hands and lean upon the table, breathing in the transformations they have set in motion. The room glows softly with anticipation, and the promise of these humble loaves and rolls will carry them onward into the day's brighter bustle and the welcoming hush of the chapters to come. The morning air inside the bakery was thick with warmth and quiet expectancy as Mary and her companions prepared to begin the most crucial step of their daily ritual. Dawn's tender glow had slipped through the narrow slit of the oven door during the earlier chores, leaving behind a faint halo of heat. Now, with the loaves and rolls of yesterday's shaped dough standing ready on their wooden peels, the milkmaids paused to steady their breath, to settle their shoulders against familiar routine, and to listen for that low, welcoming hum that spoke of a hearth at just the right temperature. Mary drew the first peel board close, its surface dusted with flour that clung in fine patterns like dew upon morning grass. She bent to grasp the handle with both hands, feeling the gentle give of the seasoned timber. Around her, the other milkmaids moved in deliberate sequence, one lifting stray logs into the crackling fire, another shifting coals nearer to the oven's back wall with the slender shaft of a small shovel, and still another kneeling to extract a handful of soft ash for test. Each action was slow, measured, and in harmonious accord. As the peel board entered the oven's glowing mouth, a wash of heat rippled across Mary's arms, warm and steady, neither fierce nor timid. Within, the bread awaited its transformation. Golden loaves, each scored with precise cuts to direct their rise, basked in the radiant glow. Puffy rolls, plated and floured, held their promise of soft crumb and crisp exterior. For an instant, time seemed to stretch. Mary inhaled the faintly sweet scent of fermenting dough meeting hearth fire, and she thought she could hear the soft sigh of expansion inside each morsel. Behind her, the milkmaids tended the fire. Ellen, the youngest of the foursome, used her shovel to rake away stray embers that threatened to flare too close to the wooden peel boards. A stray coal, glowing an intense orange, skittered free across the hearth floor. With a deft tap of her shovel's handle, she steered it back into the safer edge of the hearth, where the brick lay cooler. Sparks drifted upward like tiny fireflies before they died in the oven's smoky throat. In the hush that followed, the bakery seemed to breathe in gently, its walls of thick stone retaining repeated cycles of warmth. From the oven's slit, a steady hiss arose, a soft exhalation of trapped moisture escaping the dough's rising structure. Mary closed her eyes to focus on that single note, letting the cadence of steam and ember settle her thoughts. Beside her, the gentle murmur of shared breaths formed a kind of unspoken litany, a lullaby woven from the rhythm of dutiful labor. At the far corner of the hearth, and swept a silk-thin layer of ash from the shelf reserved for fresh bread. She used the tip of a damp rag tied about her finger, revealing the old wood's grain, where darker knots shone like hidden fossils. Each sweep cleared away memories of yesterday's bake, making room for the new. When her task was complete, she washed the rag in a shallow pan of warm water drawn from the kettle at the hearth's edge, then wrung it out and laid it aside, ready for the next time it would be called into service. By the time Mary nudged her peel board back with a gentle push, the loaves had swelled until they brushed the oven's roof, their golden curves glinting where the heat shone brightest. The plump rolls had set firm, their braids etched in browning lines. Mary felt a momentary thrill of triumph, a deep, slow joy rooted in years of practice and patience. She pressed her cheek lightly against the cool wood of her handle, whispering a soft word of thanks to whatever kindly spirits governed the hearth. Then, with careful precision, she half turned the handle and began to draw the bread outward. The loaf nearest the door emerged first, its crust crackling as it cooled against the batch of air rushing in. For a heartbeat, the oven's glow dimmed, and the milkmaids murmured softly to each other, urging the next loaf forth. Mary leaned over, placing her free hand upon the edge of the deck to tether the peels until the entire board slid free once more. Each piece settled onto the wooden surface beyond, loaves and rolls alike, their crusts crackling in delicate showers of heat. The moment the last roll cleared the oven and swept, the door closed, shutting the warmth inside to preserve the hearth's ember for the next batch. A delicate steam rose from the exposed loaves as the door vanished from view, curling toward the rafters before dissipating. In that quiet, the bakery seemed to glow from within, as though the rising sun itself had chosen to linger a while beneath the low ceiling. Mary set the peels aside and lifted one of the still warm loaves, cradling its weight at the base. The crust was crisp and marble in hue, copper where the heat had pressed most keenly, and paler amber where shade still dwelt. She tapped the bread side with a careful finger. It resonated with a hollow hum, seal of thorough bakesmanship. The crumb, though unseen, promised to yield tenderly beneath the teeth. Nearby, Ellen prepared the cooling racks, slatted boards raised upon small stumps of wood that allowed air to circulate both above and below. As each loaf took its place, a faint hiss greeted its touch, a whisper of steam escaping through myriad tiny fissures in the crust. The rolls, lined like soft reeds across a board, glowed softly in the lamplight, and Mary noted how they puffed gently in the first moments of release from their heated chamber. Once all the loaves and rolls rested upon their racks, the milkmaids gathered around, allowing their fingertips to brush the edges of loaves and test their readiness. Each crumb was judged, each crust admired. The room filled with the mellow fragrance of baked wheat and faintly sweet ferment, a scent as familiar and comforting as a lullaby. No word was spoken for several long breaths, as the women let the stillness wrap around them like a cloak. In that silent communion, Mary reflected on the day ahead. Soon, butter would be creamed, herbs folded into golden loaves, and the market square would awaken to barter and laughter. But in these few stolen moments, all that mattered was the careful alchemy they had wrought, the humble union of flour, water, salt, and hearth fire. The morning bread lay before them in simple perfection. Crusts crackled, crumbs beckoned, and the promise of sustenance shimmered on every edge. Finally, Mary exhaled and smiled. "Let us leave them to cool a bit more," she murmured. "Then we shall slice and butter them and carry them forth." Her words seemed to unlock the quiet, and the milkmaids resumed their gentle tasks. Ellen fetched a linen cloth to cover the racks against stray drafts, and arranged the boards so each variety stood apart, and the youngest, Beth, set the kettle back upon the embers, ready to draw more warm water for the tasks to follow. Thus, the hearth fell into its next rhythm, the freshly baked loaves resting in patient readiness. Beyond the bakery door, dawn had fully broken, painting the village in soft gold and promising a day as steady and unwavering as the milkmaids' own devotion to their craft. And so, in the hush of that simple kitchen, Chapter 10 drew to a close, the morning bread a silent herald of labor, companionship, and the unspoken magic of the hearth. A pale river of dawn light filtered through the small diamond-paned window of the dairy, falling in slender lines across the wooden table where heavy churns had stood silent since the early morning's steady beat. In the hush that followed the final clack of the churn staff, Mary and her fellow milkmaids moved with deliberate grace, as though aware that the day's work had shifted from the rhythmic toil of churning into this more intimate, almost reverent phase, transforming the yielded butter into a supple, fragrant treasure fit for the market's eyes and tongues. They began by shaking the churn lid free and lifting away the lid's rim, exposing pale clots of butter clustered around the paddle. Steam still rose faintly from the warm churn, slipping across their fingers as they disentangled lumps of butter from the worn wood. Each handful felt dense and pliant, cold from yesterday's store, yet faintly yielding to the press of knuckles warmed by lingering hearth heat. With soft murmurs, they placed these lumps into a deep earthenware bowl, its interior glazed smooth, its rim chipped at one corner from seasons of similar labors. Mary carried the bowl to the stone sink, its surface cool and damp from the morning's well-drawn water. The basin was carved of gray stone, mottled by years of contact with milk, cream, and water. In the pale half-light, droplets beaded on the lip of the basin like tiny moonlit pearls. She turned the tap of the wooden spout, letting a gentle stream of well water flow over the butter. The milkmaids alternated between running cold water through their fingers and massaging the butter with nimble thumbs, washing away residual buttermilk. Tiny rivulets carried off grass-tinged whey, swirling around the bowl's interior before spilling down the stone sink. As water sluiced through their hands, the butter assumed a cleaner hue, paler, almost translucent at the thin edges, with a soft gleam where fingers had coaxed it smooth. Each diverted stream carried away what remained of the farm's morning yield, the sweet hint of grass and dew, the faintest tartness that lingers when cream lies too long. In this act of rinsing, there was a ceremony of purity, setting the butter free from its own byproducts, readying it for the gentle alchemy of salt and herb. When the water ran clear, the milkmaids drained the bowl and transferred the butter to a second, smaller wooden trough insulated by thick linen at its base. The trough's interior had been rubbed smooth over many seasons, so that butter seemed almost to glide against its walls. Here the women gathered around. Each took up a small wooden paddle and with deliberate strokes they pressed and folded, merging separate clumps into a single mass. From a courseware jar on a nearby shelf Mary retrieved a pinch of rock salt, white crystals larger than grains of wheat. She let them fall between her fingers in a steady rain, the salt striking the pale butter like tiny stars. A hush settled as the milkmaids counted out sprigs of thyme, short stems of green leaves, still scented with the night's dew and the faint smokiness of last evening's hearth fire. They stripped the leaves, discarding slender woody stalks, and chopped the herbs finely on a small wooden board, their fingers steady as they guided the blade. The scent of thyme rose clear, pungent yet sweet, melding with the cool earthiness of fresh cream. With practiced care, Mary scattered the chopped herb across the butter's surface. Another milkmaid sprinkled salt on top. Then each woman pressed the butter down, folding it over itself in a sequence of turns. Press, fold, turn, press again. These movements repeated in a slow, almost meditative cadence. The butter took on a marbled effect, thin veins of green curling through a pale yellow field. As they worked, the aroma of herbs and sweet cream filled the small room, mingling with the earthy scent of stone and the distant warmth from the hearth oven still gently glowing beyond the low lattice window. In this quiet, the milkmaids spoke in whispers, reminders not to let the butter soften too far, hints that the market hour would draw near, assurances that the shapes they formed would please the day's customers. Mary paused in her folding to feel the butter's texture, soft yet firm, yielding to the slightest pressure but resisting to hold its form. It was in this precise balance, between pliability and solidity, that the day's success lay. When the mass of butter had reached uniform smoothness, Mary scooped up a handful and pressed it into a slender wooden mold, carved in the shape of a small log. She turned the paddle to coax every crevice full, tapping lightly to settle the butter. Then she lifted the mold away, revealing a perfect golden cylinder etched with parallel grooves. She set it on a board dusted with linen, its surface cool enough to firm the butter quickly. Beside it, another milkmaid repeated the process, producing more logs, each as meticulously shaped as the next. The room, bathed in the gentle glow of morning, grew warm with the shared labor. Light shifted across the boards, illuminating each log of butter in turn, soft ochre cylinders lined up like grains of harvest. Mary's hands paused to brush a stray thyme leaf off one, smoothing a small bump with her fingertip. She stepped back, folding her arms beneath her apron, and allowed herself a moment to admire the results. Four neat logs of herb-kissed butter, poised on their resting board, awaiting the next chapter of their journey. Outside, crows called softly from the roof ridge, and the breeze bore the faint bustle of the village coming to life. From the bakery's open door came the low hum of conversation as fellow milkmaids set forth loaves and rolls for display. Soon, paper signs with hand-drawn lettering would be pinned beside the goods, and the steady exchange of coin and bread would begin. But for now, in this quiet interlude, Mary lingered in the dairy's cool air, breathing in the mingled scents of water, stone, and her handiwork. Each log of butter was a promise, of crusty bread spread with herb-kissed richness, of hearthside suppers and simple midday repasts. The shape of each cylinder was a testament to early hours spent tending cows, to the tireless swing of churn paddles, to the communion of hands and materials. Beneath lamp and window light, the butter lay waiting, its pale gold hue a quiet beacon of comfort and sustenance. As Mary gathered the logs onto a clean cloth, preparing to carry them to the counters where bread already browned in the oven's afterglow, she felt the weight of slow, steady purpose. Each step, from milking to churning, from rinsing to creaming, had led here to this moment of pause before the market's bustle. In the gentle hush of the dairy, she savored the calm, knowing that soon warmth and voices would fill the room again. And yet, in this fragile morning quiet, she held fast to the ease of measured motions, the grace of well-practiced hands, and the promise of golden butter shaped and salted, ready for hands that would spread it on warm bread, and hearts that would find comfort in its simple goodness. With a final look at the neat logs, Mary tucked the cloth carefully around them, lifting the bundle as one might cradle a small treasure. The churn stood silent behind her, its day's duty fulfilled. Beyond the dairy door, the bakery's warmth beckoned. Ahead lay Chapter 12, where loaves, rolls, and these very logs of butter would be arranged in waiting baskets, artfully set for villagers to behold and purchase. Stepping out, Mary carried more than butter in her arms. She carried the labor of dawn, the quiet alchemy of churn and limb, and the soft promise that even the simplest of tasks could yield a sweetness worth sharing. The bakery's hearth had cooled to a steady warmth when Mary and her fellow milkmaids turned their attention from kneading and baking to the final, quiet business of presentation. The early sun, climbing in a pale arc above the thatched rooftops of the village houses, poured gentle light through the small latticed window. Dust motes drifted lazily in its beams, as though performing a slow ballet above the worn stone floor. In the hush that followed the morning's clatter of shovels and wooden paddles, the milkmaids found themselves drawn into the simple ritual of setting out the day's wares. It was here, in this unhurried pause between labor and trade, that the care taken in every preceding hour was given its final, satisfying form. First came the counters. Carved from stout oak beams and darkened by years of kneading and rolling, the surfaces bore the faintest traces of flour and butter. Mary fetched a bowl of clean, cool water drawn from the well, its surface reflecting the sun's pale gold. With a damp cloth, she began to wipe the counters in long, even strokes. Each pass of the cloth swept away the last remnants of dough clinging to wood grain, leaving behind only the subtle aroma of honey and wheat. When one side of the cloth grew speckled with crumbs and hardened flour, she dipped it again and sprang it out lightly, sending tiny droplets into the air like dew. Her companions moved in concert, their gentle murmurs punctuating the soft swish of cloth on wood. The counters, when at last clear, gleamed softly in the morning light, a blank canvas awaiting careful arrangement. Next, baskets were prepared. These were not mere vessels but silent heralds of the day's labor, each woven from supple willow sinuously bent and bound with the skill of decades. The milkmaids lined each basket with square-cut cloths of homespun linen, some pale flaxen, others dyed a faint blue with woad or a soft saffron rust with weld. They laid the cloths neatly, folding corners in precise triangles so that the edges draped just so. The effect was quietly elegant, a soft bed of fabric ready to cradle the golden produce of the hearth and churn. One by one, loaves and rolls were selected. Mary reached for a batch of plated loaves, their crusts whisper crisp and gently browned at the curves where strands overlapped. She placed each loaf at the basket's heart, careful to position them like sleeping birds nestled side by side. A companion added a scattering of round dinner rolls, their pillowy tops brushed with a final glistening wash of buttermilk, lending a delicate sheen. Between these, small logs of churned butter, soft and pale, flecked with sprigs of finely chopped thyme, took their rightful places. The arrangement was not hurried. The milkmaid straightened a sprig of greenery here, adjusted the tilt of a loaf there, seeking the perfect balance of form and function. It was, in its own way, a modest artistry. As baskets filled, Mary turned to the wooden boards that sat ready on the adjacent table. These boards, smooth and worn from long use, would display the butter and the smallest parcels of rolls for inspection. She spritzed each board lightly with water from a small gourd dipper, then passed a cloth over them until they gleamed. On one she placed curly brown butter leaves molded from the cooling churn. On another, a neat row of honey-sweet seed cakes that had cooled overnight in the hearth's warmth. Each board was labeled with simple hand-lettered signs, a slip of parchment folded and secured with a stub of beeswax, etched in dark ink with words like fresh butter, 6 pence, seed cakes, 4 for a penny, and brown bread, 2 pence per loaf. The lettering, though modest, bore the graceful loop of a practiced hand, lending the plain text an unexpected elegance. By now, the room was alive with the gentle clink of pottery plates as the milkmaids transferred small buttermilk bowls and rosemary-salted dishes to the display. A low murmuring of contentment passed among them. They exchanged quiet smiles and small compliments on one another's flourishes. The air filled with the mingled scents of warm grain, fresh cream, and aromatic herbs, a fragrance that seemed to anchor the morning and promise good fortune at market. The latticed window, its wooden frame still cool with dawn, provided the final, most flattering light. Mary drew back the small shutter on its lower hinge, allowing a broader beam to fall across the trestle table. The sun slanted in past early hawthorn blossoms drifting by outside on an awakening breeze. The light played across crusts and butter curls, lending each morsel of bread a soft halo. Tiny specks of dust glinted like stars in the shafts, adding to the quiet enchantment. A single, unbroken moment stretched between them, the hush before the first customers tread on the flagstones beyond the door. In this tranquil interlude, Mary straightened the price signs once more, as if willing them to hold firm against the day's commerce. She exchanged a glance with Alice, who stood by the door holding a small lantern, though it was hardly needed now, its flame flickering calmly in the fresh morning air. Alice's hair, still powdered with fine flour where she had rested her head during the kneading, shone like spun silk in that beam of sunlight. There was laughter in her eyes, a quiet confidence born of mastery and tradition. As the first distant footfall sounded on the path outside, the milkmaids scarcely noticed. They were so absorbed in the perfection of their display. Yet when the wooden latch began to turn, the room's hush rippled into motion. Mary stepped back to let the first villager inside, her hands folded before her. The baskets of golden crusts, the pale pats of butter and the soft, doubled layers of linen stood ready to greet the newcomer. It was in that moment, poised between solitude and exchange, that the quiet pride of the milkmaids found its true expression. For all the hours of pre-dawn stirring, of back-breaking churning and the careful tending of fire and dough, it was the simple act of setting out goods, with care, with patience, with reverence for the gift of sustenance, that brought the true satisfaction of their craft to life. The door opened fully now, letting in the first breath of the village morning. Fresh grass rising from common fields, distant laughter from children running along the lane, the lowing of cows awaiting their next milking at the far end of the pasture. Mary offered her greeting in a low, calm voice, as though she had always been here, always part of the steady quiet. The villager smiled, eyes bright at the rich sight of bread and butter, and Mary reached for a loaf, tucking the edges of its cloth gently around the crust before offering it across the wooden counter. And so the day's trade began, not with haste but with the unhurried grace of well-honed routine. Each loaf was lifted with respect, each roll was chosen with measured deliberation. The buttery fragrance mingled with the soft murmur of exchanges, stories, and laughter. Outside, the sun climbed higher, but within the bakery's small, stone-walled chamber, time moved at a gentler pace, measured by the placement of baskets and the turning of a signboard, by the setting out of goods that bore witness to the milkmaids' quiet devotion to their age-old craft. Morning settles over the market square in a gentle hush, like linen draped over a cradle. The first hazy rays of sun tiptoe along the low eaves of the timber-frame shops, scattering pale gold upon pots of butter and freshly baked loaves. In this quiet hour, the village's chatter begins not with clamor but with soft footfalls and half-spoken greetings, the subtle music of labor and livelihood awakening together. Mary and her fellow milkmaids stand behind their wooden boards, neatly arrayed with the day's wares. Loaves of bread rest in tidy rows, their crusts a deep, burnished brown that glows in the morning light. Beside them, small logs of butter lie on plates of pewter, flecked with sprigs of thyme, their pale yellow an invitation to eager tongues. The breeze drifts across the square, carrying scents of warm dough, honeyed mead from a neighboring stall, and the ever-present tang of fresh milk. It is then that a farmer approaches, his boots leaving damp imprints on the cobbles, his wide-brimmed hat tipped low against the rising sun. He pauses before the loaf Mary has set aside, a rustic oval scored deeply across its top, promising a crackling sound when broken. The man's rough hands brush a loose crumb from the crust before he lifts the bread to his nose, inhaling its yeasty warmth. He squints at the price Mary has marked in charcoal on a small wooden sign, a single penny for a substantial loaf. "A penny?" he says, voice low and gravelly. "Surely not, good sister. Last harvest your bread sat a ha'penny cheaper." He steadies his stance, juts out his chin, a glint of challenge in his eyes. Mary inclines her head, expression mild, lips curving into a quiet smile. "Ah, but Master Thorne," she replies with calm courtesy, "flour has grown dearer since the winter storms toppled half the mill's wheel. Each coin buys only what the cost demands." She lowers her gaze as if weighing the words. "Yet for you who have traded with our dairy these many seasons, I would grant but a halfpenny off. 2 halfpennies no more." The farmer's brow furrows. He sets the loaf down, pinching the crust between forefinger and thumb. He glances toward the other stalls, where a neighbor offers a simpler, less ornate loaf for the same cost. Mary senses his hesitation and inclines forward, voice softening. "Consider too the butter, smoked herbs folded into each pat. A fine complement to fresh bread, saving the need for salt." She gestures to the golden curls of butter beside the loaves. He grunts, measuring his purse's weight in coin. Then with a slow nod he lifts the loaf. "I will take 2, he concedes at last. "But guard me against too many of these modest savings, lass, or I fare ill at home with full hands and empty purse." He hands her 2 coins and turns on his heel, the loaf tucked under his arm like a cherished ledger. As he departs, a mother steps forward. Her woven basket is lined with a faded cloth, soft from many washings. She lifts a handful of pillowy rolls, dusting them tenderly with her fingertips. The family she tends is small, 2 rosy-cheeked children who tug at her skirts, their eyes bright with hunger and delight. The rolls seem as light as clouds to her touch, and she tests their springiness by pressing a fingertip into the dough. It yields and bounces back. Perfect, she thinks. 4 rolls, please, she murmurs to Mary's companion Jane, whose hands are steady as she counts the round pieces. 2 for the children, 2 for my husband's midday staff. She lays 2 coins in the palm of Jane's hand. Beyond her, the children lean out for a taste, but she shakes her head, gentle. Not yet, little ones. We pay first, taste after. When the mother's payments are set aside, she lifts a roll by its thicker side, snaps it in half, and offers each child a piece, watching them savor the crumb and butter's sheen. Their delight ripples through the group like a shared secret. Laughter peals in the next stall. A pot of cream, fresh as silk, has overturned at the elbow of an elderly milkmaid who bent to greet a passing friend. The vessel teeters, splashes of white spilling across the stall's rough-hewn planks. The small neighbor's stall is momentarily bathed in creamy pools, shining bright against weathered oak. Instinctively, 2 stall-holders lean to help. One tucks strips of linen beneath the pot to catch drips, another snares a wooden ladle to rescue the precious sweet liquid. "Oh, my stars!" exclaims the old milkmaid, clucking her tongue. "There goes half the morning's keep." She lifts the vessel to inspect the loss and spies the gathering helpers. "Nay, dear hearts, 'tis but a drop in the pail. We shall adjust our measures and press on." Her cheeks flush a soft rose beneath her powdered brow. "But pray, let's mend this mess before the puddle solidifies." The laughter ripples gently, no mockery in its note, only the warmth that arises when neighbors share misfortune and aid with good humor. Mary steps forward with a folded cloth. She kneels by the planks, pressing the soft linen against wood grain to draw up cream slick from beneath. Jane fetches a bowl, and together they catch the stray drips, transferring them back into the upturned vessel. Even the children pause in their snacking to watch, fascinated by this sudden turn from commerce to cooperation. When the spillage is tamed and the cream once more safe, they rise as one. The old milkmaid nods in thanks and resumes her place behind her churn, striking a small bell to call the next customer. The rhythm of buying and selling, so carefully orchestrated, falls into step again. Amid the bustle, Mary greets a face not seen since the market last fortnight, a neighbor from the next shire over. He strides past with loose documents clutched beneath his arm, announcing in hushed tones the coming of a grand fair in the county town. "Horses, cloths, foreign spices," he says, voice low. "Jesters and musicians from the city will parade in open carts. I've heard tell of painted banners 20 feet long." His eyes gleam at the promise of novelty. Mary leans closer, curiosity alight. "Do you think they will need bread for so many folk? And butter to spread upon it?" She smiles at the thought of buttery rolls landing in distant hands. "Perhaps we might journey together and sample their wares," she suggests, voice soft as dawn's first light. He nods, eyes lifting to the distant church spire that crowns the horizon. "Aye, cousin. We shall go. I would trade your butter for silks uncut, and bring home tokens of the road." Their words intertwine, plans forming like dawn mists, slow and sure. All around them, the market pulses in quiet energy. A traveling peddler invites children to touch a brass rattle. A shepherd exchanges nods with a charmer selling cured hams. The caw of a lone crow echoes above stone roofs. Sunlight drapes the square, gilding each exchange with the comfort of warmth. In the midst of this calm hubbub, Mary stands steadfast, the picture of composed industry. Her woolen gown, pinned at the shoulder with a small silver brooch, catches the light as she turns to greet another passerby. Her baskets remain well stocked, her ledger balanced in inked precision. Yet in the corner of her eye she treasures the merriment born of spilt cream, the promise in a traveling fair, the soft echo of a farmer's bargaining banter. At last, the square begins to fill with more guests. Men with ledger sticks, women bearing heavy pails of vegetables, children trailing after them, clutching sweetmeats pressed behind their backs. The steady tide of commerce rises, and Mary readies herself. A nod to Jane, a smooth pat of dough upon the palm of her mind, a whisper of tomorrow's hope pressed within her heart. In this gentle clamor, the milkmaids find their rhythm once more, their labor woven into the fabric of village life, each moment a stitch that binds dawn to dusk, the mundane to the marvelous, and the simple gift of bread and butter to the greater tapestry of a world quietly turning. When the last of the morning customers drifted away from the market stall, the air in the little bakery fell into a gentle hush. The clatter of wooden pegs and the faint scrape of boards against stone still lingered, but the bustle of buyers and the low hum of gossip had ebbed. For a few moments, the heat of the hearth drifted out into the room, and the curved shadows from the shutters played on the rough-hewn table at the center of the space. It was in that stillness at the very cusp of afternoon that the milkmaids gathered for their midday repast. Mary stood first at the cauldron, a broad, black iron pot that swung from an iron hook over a gentle flame. Within, a simple soup simmered, coarsely chopped turnips, leeks with pale green rings, and parsnips sliced into uneven crescents. A handful of dried peas and a few sprigs of sage from the windowsill herb pots lent body and warmth. Steam curled upward, carrying the promise of nourishment through the kitchen's low beams. Mary dipped a wooden ladle into the cauldron, startled by the soft hiss as the vessel shifted against the embers. She filled a bowl and carried it to the table's edge, the rich odor of roots and herbs mingling with the faint tang of wood smoke still clinging to the rafters. One by one, the milkmaids took their places on sturdy benches. Ellen, whose copper hair glinted like embers in the dusty sunlight, set 2 bowls before the others, steeped with thick soup that hinted at a golden glow beneath its pale surface. Beads of condensation formed on the bowl's rims, catching the light like tiny, trembling lanterns. Margaret, who had a steady hand and a sly smile, placed a wicker basket of warm, crusty loaves in the center of the table. Loaves still flush with heat from the hearth, their perfume of yeast and grain floating like a gentle benediction among them. The first loaf was broken open by Mary's slender fingers. Its crust split with a quiet crack, revealing a crumb flecked with tiny holes, soft and yielding. She broke off a piece and handed it to Ellen, whose mouth curved in contentment before she tucked into her own serving. Butter, salted and softened to a pale cream, lay in a wooden dish beside the bread. The butter bore the faint tang of the morning's churn, flecked with tiny green specks of thyme and parsley, herbs Mary had pressed between her palms before dawn. Each of the milkmaids took a knife, scooping generous dabs of butter onto their bread, watching it pool in the warm indentations before they drew the loaf to their lips. For a moment time seemed to pause. The only sounds were the soft slurping of broth and the small scuffs of shoes on the cold stone floor. The milkmaids leaned forward, cheeks warmed by the steam rising in little spirals. The soup soothed them with its familiarity, each mouthful a reminder of the day's simple cycles: tending cows, churning cream, coaxing bread from flour and water. Conversation flowed quietly, like a subdued river. Margaret spoke of the new calf named Betsy, born during the night, whose mother's lowing had echoed through the sheds until dawn. Ellen described the soft bristles of fresh butter that appeared on the churn staff during the morning's toil, each lump a testament to their careful rhythmic work. At Mary's urging, a bowl of cool milk was passed from one to the other, its surface faintly glossed by a drop of dew that had clung to the pasture grass earlier. The milk, drawn from the lead cow herself, was still sweet with the taste of spring clover. Each woman tipped the bowl to her lips, letting the liquid slide over her tongue before swallowing with a soft sigh. It was a simple gift, but one they relished anew each day, a reminder of the land's generosity. Outside the shuttered window, a beam of sunlight cut through the cottage gloom, striking a cloud of dust motes that danced lazily in the still air. They seemed to circle the table in a moment of quiet revelry, as though celebrating the pause in labor. Mary watched them drift, remembering the frosted mornings when these same sunbeams had fallen on dew-laden hedges and on the backs of grazing cows. Now they served as gentle heralds of afternoon, toil anew but first, a restorative haven. As the last of the soup was scooped clean from the pot, Ellen rose to stir the embers beneath the hearth, coaxing the scattered coals back into warmth. She placed a fresh log upon the smoldering pile, and the fire crackled to life, its glow flickering across the table. The women drew their benches closer as if to absorb its heat, and Mary tucked her skirts beneath her knees, pressing her fingers against the folds to keep them free of soup spatter. Throughout the meal, small tokens of camaraderie passed between them. Margaret offered Mary a piece of sweet apple from her pocket, a rare indulgence saved from the morning's market. Mary accepted it with a soft "thank you," biting the fruit's crisp flesh with a faint snap. Ellen, meanwhile, whispered a joke about a neighbor's cow that had wandered into her vegetable patch the day before, flattening rows of leeks as though they were mere weeds. Laughter, quiet and warm, swelled through the room like a soft bell. When the final crust was broken and the butter dish scraped clean, Mary stood and stretched her arms overhead. The gentle ache in her shoulders was welcome, a proof of work done in harmony with dawn and daylight. She collected the empty bowls and stacked them expertly, her movements smooth with familiarity. The milkmaids rose too, brushing flour from their gowns, tugging at stray strands of hair that had escaped their kerchiefs. Before returning to the churn and the oven, they paused together at the window. The sunlight had shifted westward, gilding the thatch roof thatched beyond the cobblestones and turning the gilded sign of the bakery's swinging board into a bright beacon. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of newly turned earth from the fields, of barley and oats awaiting the coming harvest. The promise of labor yet to come lay in that breeze, but so did a sense of renewal, as if the midday repast had refilled their spirits as well as their bodies. Mary inhaled deeply, savoring the moment. The soft sigh of wind against the shutters might have been a lullaby. The milkmaids, too, lingered at the pane, savoring the second of repose before the afternoon's work. There would be more dough to shape, more loaves to bake, more butter to blend with herbs, but for now they allowed themselves the luxury of calm. Dust motes continued to dance in the lingering sunbeam, and for a heartbeat, they traced lazy loops as though marking out the hours by their flight. Finally, Mary turned away from the window and beckoned the others back to the hearth. The distant clatter of a passing cart reminded them that the world beyond still turned, that trade and talk would soon resume. Yet within the four walls of the bakery, there was only this measured peace, of bellies filled, of friendships held, of hands rested for a breath. They returned to their places at the long table, not yet for another meal, but for a final shared moment of reflection before the day's steady rhythm resumed its course. With soft steps, they crossed the room together, Mary leading the way toward the workbench where fresh flour awaited, while Ellen fanned the fire into a steady flame. Margaret prepared the wooden bowl for the next measure of dough. Outside, sunlight still gilded the street and the fields beyond, and inside, their hearts carried the warmth of midday sustenance, a gentle fuel for the hours to come. In that quiet pause, they found a simple truth, that in each bite of bread and each spoonful of soup there lay not just nourishment for the body, but a shared comfort that sustained them through the labors of dawn and the promise of afternoon yet to unfold. The midday sun had climbed to its zenith and cast a gentle heat upon the thatched roof of the dairy bakery. Within the low-ceilinged chamber, a lazy beam of light slipped between heavy shutters to rest upon the rough-hewn boards of the long work table. The milkmaids, flushed from their humble meal of soup and bread, now drew a collective breath and turned once more to their labors. Their cheeks still bore the warm flush of midday rest, yet now their shoulders squared with steady purpose. The familiar comfort of routine spread through them like a soft sigh. The afternoon batch awaited. Across from Mary, who had broken the last crust of bread at midday, stood Anne and Grace, each wiping their hands on the skirts of their gowns as they gathered their tools. The fine linen cloth that had covered the dough trough was folded aside, revealing the empty wooden vessel, its interior worn smooth by countless turnings of the paste beneath their fingers. Anne mustered her sieve and ladle, while Grace fetched a small wooden cup hewn from oak, its handle darkened by years of contact with hands steeped in flour. With calm deliberation, Mary reached for the stout sack of wheat flour resting against the wall. She cupped her palm beneath the coarse linen drawstring, loosened it, and peered into the pale expanse. A faint swirl of milky dust rose to greet her, settling upon her sleeves and the tabletop in a whisper of white. She spooned the flour by careful handfuls into the sieve, allowing the finer particles to fall through in a steady rain onto the board beneath. Behind her, Grace placed a marked wooden peg beside the trough, a makeshift measure that had served them well through many seasons. When the mound had reached the proper height, just above the peg's notch, Mary drew the bamboo sieve aside and brushed the remaining bran back into the sack with a worn cloth. The sifted flour formed a soft pile, like a winter's snowfall encircling the trough. Grace then dipped the oak cup into a stone jar of water warmed by the hearth, pouring steady dribbles into a shallow well in the flour. Steam rose in feathery tendrils, scenting the air with the promise of fresh dough. Each drop was counted with the same precision as the morning's first batch, though now the measure was tempered by experience. No scales, only practiced eyes and steady hands. And knelt before the trough, her leather shoes resting lightly on the dusty floorboards. She took a pinch of salt from a small pewter dish and scattered it in concentric circles around the flour mound. The salt crystals glimmered in the sunbeam, and in that passing glow each milkmaid glimpsed the faint promise of well-risen loaves. Anne's fingers traced a shallow crater in the center, and Grace, kneeling beside her, began to draw the surrounding flour into the water, coaxing slowly a rough paste to form. Their motions were as natural and unhurried as a trestle's turn upon its hinges. The dough was at first shaggy and uneven, but with each fold and tucking motion it grew more cohesive. Mary pressed the mass firmly, palm against palm, as the warmth of her hands spread through the mixture. The paste gave under her fingers like soft clay, and a faint sheen of damp grain glowed upon its surface. When the mass had begun to hold shape, Grace, kneading with rhythmic determination, lifted one end and folded it toward her, then pressed and turned it again. Each rotation banished a little more air, encouraging the gluten strands to align. The hearth's fire, kindled in the morning, now danced low and red in its iron grate. A thick log crackled as a curled tendril of smoke wound upward, and the milkmaids paused to watch the embers. Mary placed her hand near the hearth's rim, feeling the gentle radiance upon her skin. The day's work surged through her limbs in a quiet pulse. Grace reached for the bellows and, with measured bellows puffs, coaxed a shiver of flame along the charred timbers. The blaze leapt obediently, forging snarled tongues of heat that licked the sides of the oven's iron door, and traced a grain of flour with her fingertip, smudging a pale line down her palm. "The fire grows willing," she murmured, her voice soft as the hush of distant wings. Grace nodded, her eyes not leaving the hearth's mouth. A small rake of coals cleared the edge of the sill, ensuring the warmth would not harry their dough too fiercely. The wood's aroma, earthy and rich, combined with the yeasty tang of rising paste to fill the room with its warm, heady promise. With grace and familiarity, the milkmaids returned to their kneading. Now the dough yielded with a supple resistance, breaking clean under each press, then springing gently back toward shape. Mary cupped a handful and held it to the light, noting the fine network of bubbles that glimmered just beneath the surface. It was a sign. The yeast, born of the morning's starter, had begun its silent work. Grace patted the mass into an even sheet, while Anne, with equal care, swept a scattering of flour dust atop it, preparing the surface for the next fold. When the paste shone smooth and pliant, they drew the trough near the hearth's edge and slid the dough within. Mary retrieved the floured linen cloth and draped it across the rim, tucking the cloth's edges beneath the trough's lip. The thin fabric would guard the dough against drafts as it rested, while the warmth of the embers below coaxed a swift initial rise. Grace returned the bellows to its hook by the wall and clicked the oven's iron latch shut. The soft glow behind its tiny port suggested a tenderness of heat that would nurture the dough without overwhelming it. Left in silence save for the heart's murmur, the dairy bakery seemed to exhale. Time pressed gently onward. The milkmaids leaned against the table, hands splayed upon the wood, and watched the hearth. Through the shutter's narrow slits, the sun hovered still high, yet Merryweather's church bell tolled twice, reminding them that the afternoon hours seldom paused for mortal repose. Rest did not beckon. Their labor continued. After a moment's hush, Anne returned to the flour sack to knead in another small batch of dough for the evening trade. Grace carefully stoked the hearth once more, adding a thin shelf of kindling to revive the ember's glow. Mary, her brow damp with effort, straightened and clasped her hands before her. "Soon we shall shape the loaves," she said, her voice steadier than her racing pulse. "But for now let the dough awaken in its warmth." While the trough warmed, a lazy curl of steam seeped from beneath the cloth, carrying the dough's faint aroma, an artful mixture of earth, grain, and promise. The milkmaids exchanged soft smiles, each content in the knowledge that their craft was patient. In stillness would bloom the very heart of their day's bread. They touched briefly the tools of their labor, Anne's sieve, Grace's oak cup, Mary's great wooden paddle, and found comfort in the subtly worn marks these held, a nick here, a scratch there, like the lines upon an elder's face. Outside, a breeze rustled through the hawthorn branches that bordered the lane. Within, the hearth's light danced across the pale walls, and the trough, now brimming with silent industry, sat awaiting its next summons. Soon the milkmaids would lift the cloth and feel, with spreading anticipation, the dough's soft pulse beneath their fingers. But until that moment they simply paused, immersed in the humble peace of afternoon heat, the hearth's steady glow, and the quiet symphony of preparation. Thus, in measured calm, the afternoon batch took its first breath. The day's rhythm pulsed on, from careful measuring of flour through strong, practiced kneading, to the hushed interlude of resting dough and the maintenance of a watchful hearth. In the pause between labors, the milkmaids found a moment's grace, knowing that soon they would shape, bake, and yield once more the simple alchemy of grain and fire, transforming humble ingredients into sustenance for body and heart alike. And so, the current of their toil flowed onward, guiding them toward the chapter yet to come. A gentle hush settles over the bakehouse as the last heat of mid-afternoon sun filters through the mullioned windows. In the quiet that follows the steady clatter of wooden peels and the deep sigh of the hearth's remaining warmth, Mary and her fellow milkmaids turn their attention to the loaves that have just emerged from the oven. Each round and oblong loaf, still glowing at the edges, bears the imprint of careful scoring, a jagged seam that has split open under the heat, revealing tender crumb within. These loaves, their crusts crackling softly as they settle, will now be transferred to a simple, slatted wooden rack to cool. The rack stands, unadorned, in a corner beside the larder door. It has been constructed from seasoned oak timbers, each slat carved with gentle bevels to allow maximum air circulation. Sunlight falls on its tiers in pale shafts, illuminating flour dust that clings to the wood grain. Mary lifts the first loaf, its base still warm enough to frost her fingertips with a whisper of heat, and lays it carefully across the top shelf. Beneath, a second shelf holds two longer loaves, their edges rounded by the oven's embrace. On the bottom, rolls of swirled dough breathe out tiny puffs of steam. The milkmaids work in silence, mindful of each loaf's delicate arc. As the loaves cool, the milkmaids prepare the salted butter that will test for texture and flavor. They gather at a small work table set just beyond the hearth's reach. In a shallow wooden bowl, pale yellow butter glistens with a soft sheen, flecked with purplish-green sprigs of thyme that have been folded in earlier. The butter is still malleable, warmed by the residual heat of hands and hearth alike. A butter knife, its handle worn smooth by seasons of turning and spreading, rests atop a cloth near the bowl. The pale linen cloth, faintly scented of beeswax polish, bears a pattern of faint flour stains, evidence of countless days spent tending dough and cream. Mary slices off a portion of butter and sets it upon a small wooden trimming board. With measured strokes, she spreads it upon the top of a still warm loaf. The butter sighs as it meets the heat, edges of the smear soften, curl, and melt into the crust's fissures. A fine mist of butterfat rises, carrying the scent of fresh baked wheat, of hearth smoke, of the morning dew that once settled on the grain in the fields. Mary leans forward to inhale, eyes half closed as she trusts her senses to guide her. The butter seeps into the small hollows of the crust, painting them a soft golden hue. She breaks off a corner of crust and lifts it slowly, listening for the faint crack of crispness before the crumb yields beneath her teeth. There is a moment of pause as she tastes. The crunch of crust gives way to crumb that is pillowy and moist, the butter lending a whisper of salt that lingers long after the first bite. Mary notes, by feel on her tongue, the evenness of the salt's distribution, neither too bold nor too timid. The thyme has offered a gentle note of resinous summer air, but not so strongly as to drown the loaf's simple warmth. A fine sweetness, born of fermentation and of the wheat's own sugars, finds its place beside the savory. She allows that taste to settle before speaking in a quiet tone. "This loaf is ripe for the market stall," she says, drawing out her words in the calm hush. Her companions nod, each performing the same ritual upon their designated loaves. Elspeth chooses a slender, elongated loaf whose scoring formed a delicate, leaf-like pattern. She spreads butter with careful, upward strokes, tilting the loaf so that the melting butter pools along the scored vein. When she tastes, her eyebrows lift in silent approval. Agnes, with graying hair pinned taut beneath her linen coif, tastes a rounder boule, noting the slight resilience of crust-to-butter union. Even the youngest milkmaid, little Joan, brave in her apron too big at the shoulders, tastes and smiles at her own assessment, too buttery at first but the time balances it right later on. As each milkmaid confirms the success of a loaf, Mary turns to a pot of dark iron nails and twine. She selects slender cedar tags, rectangular slivers of wood, each hand-whittled and sanded smooth. With a fine-pointed quill dipped in sepia ink, she writes brief notations: white wheat, country sourdough, rustic rye, and herbed oat. Each tag is pierced with a small hole and tied by dark twine to the loaf's crusty ear or around the braid of a plaited roll. These tags mark special loaves reserved for loyal patrons: Mrs. Atkinson of the Manor, the miller's household, Mistress Kenton who welcomes no bread without rye, and the apothecary who seeks the sourdough crumb to breakfast with honey. The tags dangle like small pennants, fluttering slightly as the cooling air drifts from an open shutter. Outside, a soft clatter of hoof on cobbles signals the approach of a cartwheel turning into the yard. The milkmaids breathe, exchanging calm glances, each mindful that soon they will step outside to the market square. Just as their tags declare, they will offer these loaves in good measure to those who value them most. But for now, they remain within the bakehouse, content to cradle each loaf in sight and advert its qualities among themselves. In the intervening moments, Mary pads toward the window where a moth flutters against the pane. She parts the shutters to admit a slender beam of sunlight that falls across the tiers of cooling loaves. Dust motes drift like lazy spirits in the shaft of light. The milkmaids turn to adjust wooden ladder-like feet beneath the rack, ensuring that each shelf is level as the bread settles. Beneath the bottom shelf, Agnes kneels to brush away stray flour with a stiff bristled brush. The bristles murmur against the floorboards, raising tiny clouds that drift and settle again. All the while, the bakehouse breathes quietly around them, the slow hiss of the hearth as embers cool, the measured drip of water from a pot where the churn paddles have been rinsed, the gentle susurration of linen skirts moving across stone slabs. The day's rhythms, so exacting in their repetition, bring solace in their familiarity. The milkmaids feel the memory of every loaf they have shaped, every churn they have turned, every crust they have coaxed to golden splendor. Here, in these last moments of loaves cooling and butter melding, they find a soft satisfaction that cannot be hurried. Mary returns to the butter bowl and, lifting the wooden lid, smooths its surface once more. She presses a final pinch of salt together with the last bits of thyme and refolds the butter into a neat, low mound. Then, with a small wooden stamp carved with the bakery's mark, a sheaf of wheat flanked by 2 churn paddles, she makes a gentle impression upon the mound. It is a silent signature that will accompany the loaf tags in the market stall. In these lingering minutes before the milkmaids depart to gather news and coin at the market square, they stand in quiet reflection. Chapter 16 draws to a close upon this calm tableau of bread and butter, of loaves cooling on a slatted rack and of tags waiting to flutter in the breeze of commerce. Ahead, the bustle of the square will rise, voices will call and wheels will turn. Yet in this moment, the bakery holds its steady peace, teaching that even amid labor, there is room for gentle savoring, and that the simple ritual of cooling and buttering a loaf can hold its own quiet dignity. And so, with the final loaf tagged and the butter sealed in its wooden bowl, Mary and the milkmaid step back from their bench. Their hearts, lightened by the taste of warm crust and fresh cream, will soon carry them into the next chapter of the day's rhythm, the soft murmur of news and rumor on the market square, where they will share their wares, and their lives, with all who pass beneath Tudor skies. The noon sun hangs heavy above the market square, dappling the cobbles with shifting patterns of light and shade. Inside the bakery, the last loaves and churned butter rest upon their wooden boards, cooling and glistening beneath a pale beam that sneaks in through a high window. But now, with the oven stilled and the lingering scent of warm crust drifting away, the milkmaids step quietly from the hush of the bakery into the wider world beyond. They settle their skirts, smooth the linen kerchiefs at their throats, and cross the threshold into the busy heart of the village, where ordinary life pulses on beneath a slow and steady rhythm. They pause at the edge of the square, where a traveling peddler stands beneath a ragged cloth awning, his pack slung across his back like a haggard companion. A small crowd has gathered, drawn by the bright silks and odd trinkets he lays out upon a threadbare blanket. Lengths of dyed wool, glittering beads from distant lands, carved wooden pipes that promise a different kind of smoke than the boilers of the kitchen. His voice is low but insistent, rising and falling as he describes the wonders of the North Country, the hardness of the winter's snow, the trout that dart in mountain streams. The milkmaids draw close, leaning upon the edge of his display table. The peddler's breath is faintly musty from long roads and nights spent under lean stars, and his hands are stained with the dyes of the cloth he has handled. He laughs at a jest of his own making, and in that moment the milkmaids exchange shy smiles, imagining the miles he has paced since dawn. From a cobblestone nook nearby comes another voice, sharp and resonant above the general murmur. The town crier, standing on a low wooden platform beside the well, reaches up to tug at the brim of his battered hat. In his free hand rests a small bell whose crystalline tone rings out across the square. The crowd parts obligingly as he clears his throat and begins to pronounce the latest edicts and news from beyond the shire. Hear ye, he calls. This day the King's Council sends word of rising tensions along the narrow seas. In Flanders, merchants report armed bands upon the roads. And in Calais, his words roll forth like a tide, speaking of warships, of assembled armies, of new levies called for service. The milkmaids listen with quiet faces, hearts tightening at the thought of distant strife that has so little bearing on their gentle art of churning and baking, and yet touches them all the same. They exchange a glance, small, almost imperceptible, recognizing that these tidings, though remote, will find their way into everyday talk in the evenings and around hearth fires in the weeks to come. The crier's bell tolls again and the scrap of news sets tongues wagging. A dozen villagers nod gravely among themselves, a blacksmith strokes his beard, and a schoolmaster takes notes on a scrap of parchment. But amid the split-second hush that follows the proclamation, one small figure slips into the peripheral vision of the milkmaids, a beggar child, gaunt and wide-eyed, whose ragged jerkin is frayed at the sleeves and whose feet are bare against the shifting stones. She holds out a palm, trembling ever so slightly, her eyes flicking from face to face, searching for charity. One of the milkmaids, Mary by name, kneels down at the edge of the square, smoothing back loose strands of straw-colored hair from her own brow. She reaches into the pocket of her gown and draws forth a crust of bread, just a small half-loaf, firm and stale now from hours spent cooling. The child's hand extends an inch toward her, and Mary presses the bread gently into its palm. The girl's eyes widen in surprise, then soften with gratitude, and in that moment Mary sees in the child's face a reflection of her own humble beginnings. The cold mornings, the hard work, the small measure of kindness that feeds the spirit as truly as hunger demands. As the child turns and melts back into the shifting crowd, Mary rises, feeling her own heart eased by the quiet comfort of generosity. All around them, the hum of the midday market wraps the milkmaids in a comforting embrace. Voices rise and fall in a tangled harmony, the merchant hawking his wooden bowls, the gloved fingers of a noblewoman tapping out a price upon a board, the stray bray of a goat slipping its tether to nibble at a grounded cloth. Somewhere a potter clacks her wares, and the distant whinny of horses reminds the women that life beyond the square moves on. Some hurried, some leisurely, all essential to the tapestry of their village world. For a moment, the milkmaids stand as still as the figures carved upon the stone fountain at the square's heart. They draw in the warm air, scented faintly with hay and the tang of iron from the smithy, and with the promise of a late summer breeze that will soon stir the leaves in the hedgerows. They lean close to each other, sharing soft words, a mention of the peddler's fine scarlet cloth, a wry comment on the crier's booming voice, a whisper of hope that the storm clouds gathering beyond the sea's horizon will not darken their own peaceful fields. Then, with practiced grace, they turn back toward the bakery's open door. The quarter hour they have stolen for market news and passing charity wanes in the late afternoon warmth. The loaves lie cooling, the butter waits to be wrapped, the day is not yet done. As they step across the threshold, the square's din recedes, and the gentle hush of the bakery greets them. Their hands return to familiar tasks, sweeping flour from a tabletop, pressing gleaming shapes of butter into tidy bundles, arranging the final row of rolls on a basket lined with clean linen. Still, in the soft quiet that follows, they carry with them the square's lively echo, the peddler's murmur, the crier's bell, the beggar child's thanks, and the steady hum of lives woven together beneath the same open sky. And as the sun dips slowly westward, bathing the world in gold and rose, the milkmaids settle back into their rhythm, steady, unhurried, bound by the small acts of work and kindness that shape each day in this gentle corner of the kingdom. A gentle hush settles over the dairy-lined room as the late afternoon sun wanes, its slanted beams falling low through the narrow windows and casting pale golden stripes across the worn stone floor. Mary and her fellow milkmaids pause in their tasks, exchanging soft glances that speak of both fatigue and satisfaction. They have journeyed through a long day of milking, churning, kneading, proofing, baking, and setting out wares for the townsfolk. Now, with the afternoon market drawing to a close, there remains one final ritual to perform. The last dough of the day must be shaped, sweetened, and baked, destined for the evening patrons who will wander in at dusk. These small honey rolls and deeply scored hearth loaves will carry the lingering warmth of the hearth into the cool twilight hours, offering comfort to those who pass beneath lantern light on their way home. Mary reaches for the shallow wooden pan that stands on the work table, its surface smooth with age and seasoned by countless batches of rich butter and fragrant dough. She dips a handful of lard into a bowl of fine seasonings, crushed lavender from the herb garden and a pinch of ground cinnamon, and works it into the pan with deliberate strokes. The lard melts against the wood, seeping into its grain, while a dim plume of lavender-scented steam drifts upward. The milkmaids watch in companionable silence as she lifts the pan, turning it so that each curve and corner gleams with a pale sheen. In this simple motion lives the promise of tender rolls, their undersides browned and crisp, their interiors pillowed soft and moist, cut through with veins of golden honey. As Mary returns the pan to its place, another maid arranges the final pieces of dough on the greased surface. Each little bulb is shaped by hand, gentle folds coaxing air into the dough, spirals pressed inward over a swath of honey that drips slowly from a spoon. The sweet liquid forms tiny pools at the centers of each roll. Their arrangement is careful, 6 rolls in orderly rows so that when they expand in the heat of the hearth, they will press together and form a single yielding block of amber-flecked sweetness. The maids kneel beside the table, leaning in to inspect each roll, smoothing imperceptible creases and ensuring uniformity. Their breath mingles with the honey's quiet fragrance, and for a moment all else is forgotten. With that delicate work complete, Mary turns to the last loaves. The dough, which has risen a final time in its trough, swells softly, its surface dimpled with tiny living bubbles of gas. She lifts a loaf upon a broad wooden peel, dusted just enough to prevent sticking, and holds it before the window. In the dying light, the dough's pale exterior seems to glow faintly, a living thing ready to transcend from raw simplicity into sustenance. Mary draws a sharp knife across the top, slicing 4 deep, confident scores, long arcs that will guide the loaf's upward split in the heat, carving open a dark seam of fresh crumb. Each cut carries the weight of skill and tradition. She feels the blade part the dough with the slightest resistance, then ease cleanly through. The resulting gashes stand like roads waiting to be traveled by steam and fire. Before the final journey to the oven, the milkmaids gather close to inspect the hearth itself. The glowing coals have settled into an even bed of embers, red and orange veins weaving through ashen gray. A few stray sparks drift up the chimney, carried away like fireflies into the dusky sky. Mary pauses to rake the coals gently with a small iron rake, shifting them to form a shallow gorge in the center and slight mounds at the sides. This will cradle the pan of honey rolls at the hearth's heart, while the loaves turn warmly on the outer edges, where heat is less fierce. Another maid steps forward to test the temperature. She tosses a pinch of flour into the air above the embers. The flour flutters for a heartbeat before curling and browning, trickling down in tiny flecks. The hearth breathes its readiness. With practiced ease, Mary slides the pan of rolls into the midst of the glowing coals, the wooden handle of the peel clicking gently against the stone floor. A slow hush follows, broken only by the whisper of the hearth's warm sighs. Then, as though answering a secret summons, she places each scored loaf in rotation around the rolls, 1, 2, 3 until 6 loaves form a ring of promise. The milkmaids step back, leaving a small circle of space around the hearth to honor the ritual. The air hums softly, the sweet scent of honey mingles with the faintest tang of yeast and the deep, ancient warmth of burning oak. They wait. The milkmaids stand shoulder to shoulder, their arms folded loosely or resting against the backs of wooden chairs. From time to time, one will step forward to peer into the dark throat of the oven, calling out the color of a loaf's crust or the sizzle of honey on metal. Their voices are hushed, a gentle commentary that floats on the heat waves. Mary listens to each murmured report, that the rolls have begun to brown at the edges, that the loaves are swelling and cracking along the scored lines, unveiling glimpses of soft crumb beneath. The oven light dances on their faces, illuminating features drawn with fatigue yet softened by anticipation. After what feels like a quiet eternity, Mary lifts the peel again and approaches the hearth. The scent of lightly burnt honey curls around her, sweet and caramelly, teasing her senses. Smoke and steam rise together as she withdraws the pan of rolls by its handle. The wood gleams with honey-scented lard, warmed to a shade darker by the heat. She places the pan on a wooden trivet in the center of the table, careful to avoid drips of molten honey. The rolls nestle in a warm, fragrant bed, their tops rippling with golden crust, tiny glints of crystallized sweetness shining faintly in the light. Already, soft cracks line the edges where the dough has grown free of its confines. One by one, Mary retrieves the loaves. Each comes forth hazy with steam, its crust crackling like the final embers of a fire as she lifts it from the hearth. She lays them on a butcher's board, the sound of crust against wood echoing softly in the room. The cuts she made earlier stand open and proud, revealing the pillowy white crumb within. Here and there little gots of honey have oozed out during baking, caramelizing into dark ribbons that scent the crust and promise luscious sweetness in every bite. The milkmaids gather around to admire the transformation, the way dough and time, warmth and watchful hands have yielded these quiet masterpieces. The room glows with the rich amber light of burnt honey and flickering hearth flames. Outside, the sky fades to violet, and a lantern is lit at the doorway, its wick sputtering briefly before steadying. The milkmaids, wearied and yet full of gentle triumph, begin to clear the space around the table. A towel is draped over the rolls, preserving their warmth and moisture. The loaves rest exposed for a moment longer, so that steam escapes fully, ensuring crusty exteriors. Then they are arranged in shallow baskets lined with linen, ready to be displayed for the lingering wanderers who will arrive as dusk deepens into night. In the glow of the final bake, the milkmaids exchange soft gratitude and quiet relief. Their hands, now dusted with flour and honey residue, rest for a moment, palms upturned, showing lines carved by daily labor. They breathe in the combined aromas of yeast and smoke, honey and seasoned wood, and let the steady rhythm of the hearth's afterglow lull their senses. This concluding ritual binds the day into memory, the shaping of dough, the scoring of loaves, the coaxing of the oven, and the patient retrieval of warmth from its depths. With the final batch safely placed, Mary steps away from the table and straightens her gown, preparing to close this chapter of labor. Beyond the door, the evening breeze will carry the scent of fresh honey rolls through the deserted lane, calling travelers home and setting the stage for the quiet rituals that await in chapter 19. The hearth's glow had long since softened to dull embers, the hearthstone now cool beneath Mary's hand as she pressed a copper-shod shovel against each remaining coal. Evening light filtered dimly through the latticed window, casting slanted bars across the stone floor. In this hush, the gentle scrape of metal on stone was a soft punctuation to the day's labors, as though the very walls exhaled in relief. The milkmaids, still clad in homespun linsey-woolsey gowns, moved in careful choreography about the hearth, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. The air smelled faintly of char and spice, whiffs of thyme and rosemary that lingered from the butter creaming earlier, mingled with the sweet tang of spent coal. Mary bent low, the shovel's scoop sliding beneath a last cluster of cinder. She lifted slowly, allowing the ashes to fall with stifled whisper into a round metal bucket, already half full of gray powder. Her breath came easy, steady, in sync with her motion. The scrape of shovel to hearth, the gentle clink as ember met iron bucket, the soft sigh as she straightened to pass the bucket to Anne, who waited at her side, and wore a thin linen kerchief over her coiled hair, its ends neatly knotted at the nape of her neck. She shifted the heavy vessel onto a low stool beside the hearth, where it would cool further before being carried to the garden's compost heap. There, the ashes would serve to sweeten the soil come planting season, a quiet promise that the day's toil gave back to the earth. Beyond them, within the baking chamber's niche, Eliza knelt beside the long wooden trough in which dough had rested twice that day. Its interior still bore the faint imprint of knuckles and flour-dusted palms, now coated with a thin film of sticky residue. Eliza filled a shallow basin with well water drawn earlier, its surface quivering with reflected lantern light. She dipped a stout scrubbing brush, bristles worn by months of toil, into the water, then pressed it firmly against the trough's sloping side. The wood sighed beneath her strokes, releasing beads of starchy water that pooled at the bottom. Each back-and-forth motion was deliberate and unhurried, as though Eliza communed with the grain of the plank itself. When the trough's walls stood clear and pale once more, she set the brush aside and lifted the basin, allowing the last rinse to sluice through the hollow and empty onto the stone. Nearby, Margaret tended the churn paddles. Thick and sturdy, they had seen countless cycles of cream and buttermilk, their upper handles darkened by hands greased with dairy. She leaned them, 2 by 2, against a low bench and rinsed them one at a time, guiding each through the same basin of cool water. As the droplets fell, they plinked softly on the flagstones, then seeped into cracks and grooves. Margaret studied each paddle's wood grain thoughtfully, noting a faint crack at the edge of one blade where it had rocked too vigorously against the churn's side. With calm care, she ran a sliver of beeswax along the fissure, then set the paddle out to dry, propped upright against the wall so that air might pass freely around it. In these final tasks, there was a steady intimacy with every implement, an unspoken vow that each tool, however humble, would be ready to serve again come dawn. As the milkmaids worked, their voices were hushed, spoken only to guide a fellow hand or remark on the day's small triumphs. "This trough is well washed now," Eliza murmured, setting her basin aside. "By tomorrow morning we shall need a new and unsoiled wood," and nodded and began to sweep flour from the heavy counters. She took a coarse-bristled broom, long once destined for the barn, and stroked it gently over the planked boards. Fine flour rose like motes of dust in amber lamplight, drifting slow as drowsy butterflies before settling once more on the floor. Each sweep left behind a smoother, cleaner space, the board's grain restored to dark honey tones. Margaret knelt at the hearthside, brushing residual ashes from the lip of the hearth and the surrounding flags. A ripple of satisfaction passed through her as the final flecks of gray vanished beneath the broom's bristles. When every surface bore its proper sheen, Mary lifted the cooled bucket of ash and carried it beyond the door, pausing in the threshold to draw a breath of twilight air. The cottage's narrow lane was hushed, the sky above awash in pale indigo. She set the bucket against the wall outside, to be retrieved on the morrow for the compost heap. Returning inside, she paused at the line of tools neatly arrayed by the door: the iron shovel, the brass-handled poker, the long-handled brush, the wooden paddles, and the dough trough now leaning against a corner beam. Each lay side by side with deliberate precision, handles turned outward for easy grasp. Mary's fingers traced the length of a paddle, feeling the coolness of its wood, and she allowed herself a small, private smile. "There," she breathed, "all in its place." The cottage's hearth was now a quiet vessel of stone and iron, the oven door shut tight against the evening chill. A single lantern, hung from a wrought iron hook above a rough-hewn table, cast a circle of gentle light across the polished floorboards. On that table, loaves lay under a linen cloth, their crusts still warm enough to steam faintly when tapped. Beside them, small logs of pale butter, flecked with rosemary, waited to be taken by the morning's first customers. Even in stillness, the cottage thrummed softly with the day's labors, echoing the low murmur of milkmaids' footsteps, the clatter of churn and peel, the sigh of flour across wood. As Mary and her companions took their final steps through the quiet room, there was a shared sense of completion, an ending as natural as a breath exhaled. Each had brushed, rinsed, and stowed with mindful care, ensuring that tomorrow's dawn would find them ready. The hearth had been laid bare of its embers, the tools rested in neat allegiance, the floors glowed with polish. In the hush before the night's deep slumber, the milkmaids lingered for a moment under the lantern's glow, their reflections wavering orange-gold in the window panes. Here, in this simple rite of cleaning and order, lay the final cadence of their daily symphony, a gentle rising to action, a crescendo of effort, and now a gentle diminuendo into rest. Tomorrow would bring new rhythms of water and wood, of kneading and firing, of the churning dawn that once again stirred hope and labor in the milkmaids' hearts. But for this night, the hearth and the tools lay at peace, ready to sleep until awakened by the first pale light of Tudor dawn. The last customer's footsteps had scarcely faded along the cobblestones when Mary set down her lantern on the wide wooden counter. In the gentle glow of its flame, the bakery's interior felt suspended between wakefulness and slumber. Shadows pooled in every corner, where racks once bursting with golden loaves now stood partly bare, and the hearth, once a roaring heart of warmth, had cooled to a gentle amber hush. Outside, a breeze whispered among shutters. Inside, only the soft scrape of Mary's worn leather shoe on rough-hewn boards broke the stillness. She paused a moment, breathing in the lingering scents of flour and baked grain, the faint sweetness of honey rolls still resting under cloth. Across the room, Agnes lifted the poker from its iron hook beside the hearth. Sparks rose and drifted like fireflies as she coaxed the last glow to the surface, then poured a steady trickle of fresh well water onto the coals. The hiss was gentle, a vaporous sigh that spoke of closure. Tiny wisps of steam curled upward, disappearing into the low, dark rafters. With soft precision, Mary latched the heavy oven door. The thick slab of oaken wood slid home against iron hinges. The great, wheel-thick handle clicked once and the oven's breathing stilled. Light from the lantern fell on smudged surfaces, a flour trough where dough had risen, a long bench where butter had been kneaded and shaped into small logs. Mary dipped a wrung-out cloth into a basin of cool water drawn that afternoon and began to wipe. Each stroke gathered traces of yesterday's tasks, streaks of pale dough, faint globules of cream, the impression of paddle marks from churning. With careful, almost ritualistic movements, she worked from one end of the counter to the other. Agnes moved beside her, rinsing flour-dusted boards and drying them with linen towels. Their motions were deliberate, reverent. They honored the day's rhythm and prepared the space to welcome dawn once more. On a high shelf, just beneath a carved wooden beam, Mary gathered the remaining loaves. A few rustic boule with thick crusts, some tender rolls brushed earlier with buttermilk, and a small pan of honeyed twists awaited their overnight vigil. She placed them on a board, then covered each row with a heavy linen cloth. Under that protective drape, the bread would rest as the night closed in, safe from drafts and nocturnal intruders. In the stillness, the aroma grew faint but lingering, a promise of warmth awaiting the morrow's light. The oak door, ancient and worn smooth by countless hands, called for closure. Its iron studs glinted in the lantern's glow. Mary slid the wooden bar into its socket, hearing the soft rasp as timber met timber. Beyond the threshold, darkness pressed like a velvet curtain over the lane. The final latch turned with a slow, deliberate groan. The lock clicked firm. Outside, the world might whirl into moonlit shadows, but within these walls all was stilled, sealed against chill winds and stray dust. Agnes crossed the floor to double-check the shutter on the small window beside the oven arch. With a gentle push, the iron shutter swung home, leaving only the lantern's circle of light to keep vigil. Mary lifted the lantern once more and crossed the bakery's center. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her. She paused in the doorway of the back room, where churn paddles and kneading troughs hung on pegs by the door, and gave one final look over her shoulder. The line of churn paddles, once gripped by tireless hands in early dawn, now rested like sentinels. The trough's interior, scrubbed of flour and cream, gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Cotton sacks of grain and a barrel of buttermilk waited for the next morning's stirrings. All was in readiness, all was at peace. Outside the door, a hush had settled over the sleepy village. Starshine flickered weakly through the shutters, and somewhere in the distance an owl called softly. Mary inhaled the cool night air that slipped in as she stepped onto the threshold. The warmth of the bakery lingered at her back, an amber glow against the gathering dark. She turned the key once more in the lock, ensuring that the day's safekeeping was complete. The iron ward slid home, and with a gentle thud, the heavy door closed upon the small world she and Agnes had tended from dawn. Standing beneath the lantern's light, Mary let her shoulders droop in relief. Her apron, still dusted with flour, hung heavy against her linen gown. The chill of night brushed at her cheeks, reminding her that soon she would walk the short path back to her cottage. But for this moment she remained still, tracing the curve of the lantern's glass with her eyes, listening to the hush that filled the space. She remembered the day's steady chorus, the lowing of cattle at sunrise, the thump of dough against the wooden trough, the rhythmic swing of the churn staff, the snap and hiss of bread sliding into the oven, the lively chatter of villagers in the market square. Each memory lay woven into these walls, as enduring as the mortar between the stones. Agnes closed her eyes and inhaled the last waft of honeysuckle and yeast. "Tomorrow," she murmured, voice hushed against the hush, "the dawn will find us here again." Mary nodded, though words felt needless. Together, they stood for a few breaths, suspended between the labors now complete and the promise of tasks soon to come. The world outside drifted in dream, but within the bakery, time held its gentle breath. Finally, Mary lifted the lantern from its hook. The beam illuminated her path to the door one last time. She tucked her fingers around its handle, lantern heat warming her palms, a small bulwark against the night chill. Stepping outside, she placed it on the doorstep, where its circle of light would guide the milkmaids back in the hours before first light. The lantern's glow softened as she retreated, until only the dark and the subtle gleam of moonlit shutters remained. And then she closed her eyes. The day's labor lay behind her in neat order, tools cleaned, hearth cold, counters bare and ready. The night would carry away the last echoes of churn and paddle. Soon, in the hush before dawn, Mary and her fellow milkmaids would gather again, to fill buckets at the well, to lead their beasts across dew-laden grass, to churn and bake and shape the world anew with their steady hands. For now, though the oven slept, the coals were cold, and the village lay in tranquil repose beneath a vault of stars. In that calm, Mary felt the steady pulse of her work. It was not a rhythm that shouted, but one that whispered. It spoke of routine and quiet pride, of human hands coaxing sweetness from basic fare, of warmth carried through the coldest hours. As she closed the heavy oak door behind her one final time, she carried that hush with her into the night, knowing that when she next lifted the latch, the world would wait again, ready to be filled with the rolling of dough and the golden churns of dawn.